Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My name is Marcus, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 16 years old in the small town of Cedar Falls, Oregon. It was an experience that left me unable to smile genuinely for over 4 months. And even now, 15 years later, I'm careful about when and where I let my guard down. Growing up, my home was a battlefield. My parents fought constantly, screaming matches that escalated into thrown dishes, slammed doors, and sometimes worse. My mother would lock herself in the bathroom crying, while my father stormed around the house, breaking whatever was within reach. As their only child, I became an expert at making myself invisible during these episodes. My escape was the night. When the fighting got too intense, I'd slip out of the house and walk through our quiet neighborhood until the anger had burned itself out and my parents had retreated to their separate corners. Cedar Falls was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where people went to bed by 9 o'clock and woke before dawn to tend their farms or drive to jobs in the larger towns nearby. The streets were always empty during my midnight walks, which is exactly how I preferred it. The silence was healing after hours of shouting and slamming doors. I'd walk for miles sometimes, following the same routes through the residential areas, and occasionally venturing down to the old railroad tracks that ran along the edge of town. It was on one of these walks, during a particularly cold October night, that I first encountered the thing that nearly killed me. I was about 6 blocks from home, walking down Elm Street past the old Victorian houses that had been built when the town was first established. Most of them were dark, their owners long asleep, but the streetlights cast long shadows between the ancient oak trees that lined the sidewalk. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were different from mine, lighter, quicker, with an odd rhythm that didn't quite match normal walking. I turned around and saw, about 50 feet behind me, a small figure. It looked like a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing what appeared to be a nightgown or pale dress. The figure had stopped moving when I turned, standing perfectly still with its arms at its sides. My first thought was that some kid had sleepwalked out of their house, so I called out, "Hey, are you okay? Are you lost?" No response. The child just stood there, motionless. I took a few steps closer and tried again. "Do you need help getting home?" That's when the child smiled. Even from that distance, even in the dim streetlight, I could see its teeth. They were enormous, not just big for a child, but impossibly large, like a horse's teeth crammed into a human mouth. The front teeth were particularly grotesque, yellowed and uneven, and when the child smiled, they seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. I couldn't help it, I laughed. It was such an absurd, unexpected sight that a nervous chuckle escaped before I could stop it. The moment I made that sound, the child's smile disappeared, and something in the air changed. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, and every hair on my arm stood up. I remembered then the local legend my grandmother had told me years ago, about the smiling child that appeared in Cedar Falls once every few years. According to her story, it was the spirit of a boy who had died in a house fire back in the 1800s. He appeared to people walking alone at night, and if they smiled or laughed at his appearance, he would transform into something much worse. Never smile at the child in the night, my grandmother had warned me. No matter how strange he looks, no matter what he does, you must never let him see you smile. But I had just done exactly that. The child began walking toward me again, and this time I could hear his footsteps clearly even though he was still more than 30 feet away. Each step echoed like a gunshot in the quiet night. I started walking faster, not quite running yet, but definitely trying to put distance between us. The footsteps behind me matched my pace perfectly. When I sped up, he sped up. When I slowed down to listen, the footsteps stopped completely. I could feel him back there, getting closer, but I was afraid to turn around and confirm it. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I spun around to look, and my heart nearly stopped. The child was less than 10 feet behind me now, close enough that I could see his face clearly. His skin was pale as moonlight, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely black, not just dark brown or dark blue, but black like pools of oil. The hideous teeth were even more prominent up close, protruding from his mouth at odd angles. But it was his expression that terrified me most. He was no longer smiling. Instead, his face was twisted with rage, his black eyes filled with a hatred so intense it was almost physical. He opened his mouth wider, revealing rows of those terrible teeth, and let out a sound that was part hiss, part growl. I sprinted down Elm Street faster than I'd ever run in my life, my sneakers slapping against the pavement as I pumped my arms and legs. Behind me, I could hear the child giving chase, but his footsteps had changed. They were heavier now, more like an adult's feet, and they were gaining on me. The shadow started before I saw him change. A darkness began spreading across the street behind me, flowing like spilled ink, but moving with purpose and speed. The shadow overtook me within seconds, plunging the entire street into an unnatural blackness that seemed to swallow the streetlights themselves. I turned around while still running and saw something that violated every law of nature I thought I knew. The child was gone. In his place stood a towering figure, at least 7 feet tall, wearing what looked like a black robe or cloak that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was a smooth, featureless mask of white skin, completely hairless and eyeless. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging nearly to the ground, and its fingers had extended into razor-sharp claws that gleamed like metal in the darkness. This thing moved with inhuman speed, covering ground in great leaping strides that defied physics. I could hear its claws scraping against the asphalt as it chased me, leaving sparks in its wake. I was fast, but not fast enough. It caught up to me just as I reached the intersection of Elm and Main Street. One of its claws raked across my left ankle, tearing through my jeans and into the flesh beneath. The pain was immediate and excruciating, causing me to stumble and fall face first onto the pavement. The impact scraped the skin off my palms and knees, but that was nothing compared to what happened next. The creature was on me instantly, straddling my back with its impossible weight. I could feel its claws positioning themselves over my spine, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was about to die. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but terror had driven all coherent thoughts from my mind. The claws began to descend. Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, a door slamming open. What the hell is going on out here? Mr. Patterson, who lived in the house on the corner, had come outside to investigate the noise. The moment his voice broke the silence, the weight disappeared from my back. I rolled over and saw the creature dissolving like smoke in the wind, leaving nothing behind but the smell of sulfur and the memory of those terrible claws. Mr. Patterson found me lying in the street, covered in blood from the gash on my ankle and the scrapes from my fall. I was in shock, unable to speak coherently, and he later told me that I kept mumbling about never smiling again, while he helped me to his house and called my parents. They took me to the hospital in the next town over, where I received 12 stitches in my ankle and treatment for my other injuries. The doctors said I was lucky. The cut had missed my Achilles tendon by less than an inch. I never told anyone the truth about what attacked me that night. How could I? would believe a story about a child that transformed into a shadow demon. Instead, I claimed that I'd been attacked by a stray dog, which seemed to satisfy everyone except my parents, who were so shaken by nearly losing me that they finally sought marriage counseling. Ironically, their newfound focus on their relationship meant the fighting stopped almost entirely. The crisis had forced them to confront their problems instead of just screaming at each other. But I couldn't feel grateful for this silver lining, not when it had come at such a terrible cost. For months afterward, I was afraid to smile. Every time I felt the urge to laugh or grin, I remembered those massive teeth and the creature that had tried to kill me. I went through the motions of normal teenage life, school, homework, hanging out with friends, but inside I was constantly vigilant, constantly afraid. Even now, as an adult living in a different state, I'm careful about walking alone at night. And when I do smile, I always make sure I'm not alone in the darkness, where something might be watching and waiting for the chance to show me its own terrible grin in return. Some legends exist for a reason. Some warnings should be heeded, and some creatures are best left alone in the shadows where they belong. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. My name is Hector, and I've always been someone who loves the open road. There's something about riding my motorcycle through the American heartland that speaks to my soul, the endless horizons, the freedom of movement, the solitude of long-distance travel. But there was one night in rural Kansas that changed my perspective on solitude forever. A night that still makes me question what's really out there in the vast emptiness between towns. This happened about 4 years ago when I was riding cross-country from Denver to St. Louis. My plan was to take the scenic route through small farming communities, maybe camp under the stars, somewhere peaceful. I had done trips like this dozens of times before, but as anyone who's spent time on back roads knows, things don't always go according to plan. I was riding through what seemed like an endless expanse of wheat fields and pasture land, one of those stretches of highway where you can see for 20 miles in every direction without spotting a single building. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if I hadn't been worried about finding shelter for the night. When I saw a weathered road sign indicating a turnoff to a place called Millfield, I decided to take a chance. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of maybe a dozen houses scattered along a potholed main street. Most of the buildings looked abandoned, with broken windows and sagging porches. The only signs of life were two elderly men sitting outside what might have once been a general store. I pulled up and asked if there was anywhere in town I could spend the night. They looked at me like I had asked them to solve quantum physics. One of them pointed toward the empty fields and said that if I wasn't afraid of being alone, there was an old farmhouse about 3 miles east that nobody had lived in for years. He warned me it wasn't comfortable, but at least it had 4 walls and a roof. It wasn't exactly the Ritz, but I didn't have many options with darkness falling fast. I followed their directions down a dirt road that led through more wheat fields until I spotted the house sitting by itself in the middle of nowhere. It was a typical Midwestern farmhouse from maybe the 1920s. 2 stories, white clapboard siding that was now gray with age, and a wraparound porch that was partially collapsed. I parked my bike near the front steps and went inside to look around. The interior was what you'd expect from a house that had been empty for decades: dust-covered furniture, peeling wallpaper, and the musty smell of abandonment. But it was dry and seemed structurally sound. So I set up my sleeping bag in what had probably been the living room and tried to make the best of it. For the first few hours, everything was quiet except for the usual nighttime sounds you'd expect in farm country: wind through the wheat, the distant howl of coyotes, maybe an owl or two. I was actually starting to relax when I heard something that made me sit up straight in my sleeping bag. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the house. At first, I thought it might be cattle or wild animals, but the rhythm was too regular, too purposeful. It sounded like someone was walking slowly around the perimeter of the building, taking their time, maybe looking for a way in. I grabbed my flashlight and crept over to one of the broken windows to peer outside. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see across the fields, but I couldn't make out any movement. The footsteps continued for several more minutes, then stopped abruptly. Just as I was starting to convince myself I had imagined it, something slammed into the side of the house hard enough to shake the walls. Then another impact on the opposite side, like someone or something was testing the structure. I moved to a different window, and that's when I saw them dark silhouettes moving through the wheat field. At least 4 or 5 figures spread out in a loose circle around the house. What disturbed me most wasn't their presence, but how they moved. Their gait was wrong, somehow too slow, too fluid, like they were gliding rather than walking. Some would stop and seem to stare directly at the house, though I couldn't make out any faces in the darkness. I backed away from the window and barricaded myself in what had been the kitchen, using an old table to block the doorway. The room had strange marks on the floor that looked relatively fresh, deep gouges in the wood that might have been made by furniture being dragged around, or something else entirely. The impacts on the walls continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes accompanied by sounds I couldn't identify, not quite animal growls, not quite human voices. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or settling timbers, but deep down I knew better. Around 3 a.m, I heard the front door creak open. My blood turned to ice as slow, shuffling footsteps entered the house. They moved through the rooms methodically, as if searching for something. I held my breath and gripped the hunting knife I always carried while traveling, knowing it would be useless against whatever was out there, but needing something solid in my hands. The footsteps approached the kitchen door. The table I had used as a barricade began to slide across the floor, pushed by some enormous force. That's when I saw it, a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway, with limbs that seemed too long for any human body. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, and I swear I could feel it looking at me, even though I couldn't see its face. Then everything went black. I don't remember anything else until dawn. When I came to, I was sitting against the kitchen wall with my knife in my hand and no memory of how I got there. The table was back in its original position, and there was no sign that anything had disturbed the room. But when I went outside, the evidence was unmistakable. The wheat around the house had been trampled in perfect circles, as if something heavy had been moving around the building for hours. I didn't waste any time getting out of there. I packed up my gear and rode straight back to what passed for civilization in that part of Kansas. When I reached the two old men at the general store, one of them looked at me and nodded knowingly. "We told you it wasn't comfortable," he said. "Some places are abandoned for good reasons." I didn't ask him to elaborate. I just filled up my gas tank and got back on the highway, putting as many miles as possible between myself and that cursed farmhouse. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that empty house in the middle of nowhere. I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was wild animals. Maybe I was more exhausted than I realized and hallucinated the whole thing. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. There are places in this country where the darkness is more than just the absence of light, where isolation can become something far more sinister than solitude. I still love riding the back roads of America, but I'm much more careful about where I spend the night. Some buildings are abandoned for reasons that have nothing to do with economics or demographics, and some silences are warnings rather than invitations. That farmhouse taught me that even in our modern, connected world, there are still corners where ancient fears hold sway, and the old rules don't apply. I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps circling the house, or the sight of that figure standing in the doorway. And I'll never again assume that being alone means being safe. My name is Paul, and I own a small cattle ranch outside of Cedar Ridge, Wyoming. It's a tiny place, population maybe 800 on a good day, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and endless prairie. Life here is quiet, some might say monotonous, but I've always loved that feeling that nothing ever changes. The houses are mostly old farmhouses and trailers, and at night the silence is so complete it can actually make it hard to sleep. My property sits on the outskirts of town, surrounded by open grazing land and mountains in the distance. It's a good place for someone like me. I'm in my late 40s now, been divorced for about 6 years, and all I really want anymore is peace. I've been living alone since then, taking care of the cattle and working the land. About 8 months ago, strange things started happening around here. Neighbors began talking about missing livestock, cattle, and horses that would just vanish without a trace. At first, I figured it was coyotes or maybe rustlers, but the stories kept getting stranger by the day. Some folks claimed they'd seen shadows moving around at dusk. Others heard weird noises coming from their barns and corrals. I didn't pay much attention to the talk until it happened to me. That particular night, like so many others, I was in the kitchen fixing myself some dinner. It was getting late, probably close to 10:30, and it had been a long day checking fence lines. I was slicing some potatoes when I heard Rex, my German shepherd, barking like crazy out in the back pasture. Rex is usually a calm dog. He doesn't bark much unless something's really wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, expecting to find a coyote or maybe a stray dog bothering the cattle. But when I swept the beam across the field, there was nothing there. Just the wind moving through the tall grass. But Rex kept acting agitated, growling and staring off into the darkness beyond the fence line. Probably just a fox or a raccoon, I thought, and went back inside. But that uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me alone. I barely slept that night, listening to every sound outside, waiting for something else to happen. The next morning, I walked over to see my neighbor, Ed Martinez, an old rancher who'd been working this land for over 30 years. I told him what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off or tell me I was getting paranoid in my old age, but his reaction surprised me. He looked at me seriously and said in a low voice, "Paul, you need to be careful out there. Whatever's been prowling around, it ain't no ordinary animal. Something's not right about it." "What do you mean, not right?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "My grandfather used to tell stories. Things most folks don't want to remember anymore. But you keep that dog close and don't go wandering around alone after dark." I laughed, trying to brush off his words, but that feeling that something was wrong stuck with me. I went back home, turning over what Ed had said, though I tried to keep up my normal routine. A couple of days passed without anything unusual happening, until one night around 2 a.m, I woke up suddenly. It was one of those nights when the silence feels so heavy it makes you uncomfortable. The house was pitch black, and the only sound was the wind rattling the windows. I got up disoriented, and that's when I heard it, a soft sound, like footsteps dragging across the gravel outside. I went to the window and looked out toward the yard. Nothing there. But the sound continued, like someone was walking around the house in a slow, deliberate circle. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, my heart racing. At first I didn't see anything, but when I turned the beam toward the old barn, I saw it. A figure. It was tall and thin, standing perfectly still next to the barn door. My first instinct was to shout, but I found myself frozen, unable to move or speak. The figure wasn't doing anything, just standing there motionless, facing the barn as if it was studying something. I backed slowly toward the house, and the moment I closed the door behind me, the sound stopped. My breathing was rapid, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. I turned off the flashlight and stood in the dark kitchen, listening. A dull thud echoed from the barn, like someone trying to force open the door. Then, silence. I didn't go back outside until sunrise. The next day, I checked the barn thoroughly. Everything was in its place, but there was something odd on the ground, long, strange tracks that ended abruptly near the fence. They didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, too elongated to be human, too narrow to be from any animal I knew. The following week, the whole town was buzzing with similar stories. Other ranchers reported seeing the same figure lurking around their properties at night. The descriptions were always the same: tall, thin, moving in an unnatural way. Some said it was a spirit. Others talked about an old legend concerning a creature that appears in isolated communities, bringing bad luck with it. I tried not to pay attention to the stories, but the truth is, I haven't slept the same since that night. The figure hasn't come back, at least I haven't seen it again. But every time I hear Rex growling, my body tenses up and I won't leave my bedroom for hours. I keep wondering what it was I saw that night, and though Ed insists we should get to the bottom of it, something inside me would rather not know. There are many of us who have witnessed this thing, and I hope that someday we'll understand what's been happening in this valley. But part of me wonders if some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved, especially when the truth might be worse than not knowing. The strange thing is, since all this started, the town feels different. People are more cautious, more watchful. Conversations die down when strangers walk by. It's like we're all waiting for something to happen, but nobody wants to say what. And every night when I lock up the house and turn off the lights, I find myself checking the windows one more time, making sure nothing's standing out there in the darkness, watching and waiting. Whatever it was I saw that night, Whatever's been stalking this valley, it changed something in all of us. Maybe that was its purpose all along. I don't want to share the name of the town where this story took place. It's not for mystery or to add dramatic flair to what I'm about to tell, but because I want to protect it. It's a small place, almost forgotten by time, and only a few elderly families still live there in peace. If this story were to go viral, I fear that curious tourists or paranormal explorers would start arriving, disturbing the tranquility of the elders who still call it home. The town in question is practically a ghost itself. With no more than 8 inhabited houses, the rest are crumbling ruins that time and nature have reclaimed. When I was a child, my parents would take me to visit my grandparents, who had lived in that place for as long as I could remember. Life there was simple, without the luxuries of the city, but for a 10-year-old boy like me, it was a paradise of freedom. My younger brother and I would ride our bikes and explore the place from end to end, without worrying about traffic or the dangers we would face in a city. The town was safe, and although everything seemed in poor condition and obviously abandoned, we felt comfortable exploring every corner. There was one house in particular that always caught our attention. It was set apart from the rest, on the edge of town, solitary, and with an air of mystery that intrigued us. Every time we passed by, we saw 3 children playing in the yard. They weren't like the few elderly people who remained in the town. These children always looked serious, almost distant, but they never spoke to us. They just stayed there, watching us with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. My brother and I tried to greet them, but we never got a response. They would just look at us and sometimes turn their backs on us, as if our presence didn't matter to them. Several summers passed like this. Sometimes the children were in the yard, sometimes they weren't. Over time, we stopped paying so much attention to them, assuming they were just another family that had somehow stayed in that ruined town. My grandparents never mentioned them, and we didn't talk much about them either. They were just another part of that peculiar landscape. However, one afternoon something changed. My brother and I rode our bikes past the house, and as usual, saw the 3 children playing in the yard. The strange thing was that this time they didn't seem to be alone. Looking more closely, we noticed a figure in the window of the house. Between the dirty and torn curtains, an older woman was watching us with an expression that froze our blood. Her face was marked by deep wrinkles, and her gaze was one of pure hatred, as if our mere presence enraged her. The way her eyes pierced us from the shadow of the house made my brother stop dead in his tracks. He looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes. Suddenly, the children who were playing outside stopped what they were doing and turned toward the window, as if they too had felt the woman's presence. They ran toward the house, entering hurriedly and slamming the door behind them. The woman at that same moment pulled the curtains, covering the window and disappearing from our sight. Everything happened in a matter of seconds, but for us, it felt like an eternity. Without thinking twice, we turned around and quickly headed to my grandparents' house. Fear had us rushing. Sweat was running down our foreheads, and when we arrived at their house, we could barely speak. Between gasps, we told them what we had just seen. The children, the woman, her expression of rage, and the feeling that something wasn't right in that house. My grandparents, who until that moment had been calm, looked at each other with concern, and my grandfather was the first to speak. "What house?" he asked, frowning. "There's no family with children here. It's been years since young people lived in this town, much less children." We insisted. We explained where the house was, described the children and the woman, but they seemed increasingly puzzled. My grandmother mumbled something about how strange the situation was, while my grandfather got up from his chair with a serious expression. He told us to come along. He wanted us to show him the house. We all went out together toward the house in question. My grandfather didn't seem convinced, but he let us guide him. When we arrived, we pointed to the house from a distance, the same one where we had seen the children and the woman. My grandfather stopped dead and looked at us seriously. "Are you sure it's this one?" he asked. We nodded because we were absolutely sure. There was no other house in that part of town. "That house has been abandoned for decades," said my grandfather. "No one has lived here for at least 30 years. My brother and I looked at him incredulously. There was something in his tone of voice that we didn't like. To prove his point, my grandfather crossed the neglected yard and approached the door of the house. With a creak of old wood and the squeak of hinges, he opened the door. The interior was as decayed as the exterior. The walls were covered with mold. The ceiling looked ready to collapse, and there was no furniture, no sign that anyone had inhabited that place in a long time. The air inside was thick and cold, as if time had stopped in that house. My grandparents looked at us expecting an explanation and with some annoyance, but we didn't know what to say. We were sure of what we had seen, of the children, of the woman in the window. How was it possible that this house was abandoned if we had always seen people inside? After that day, we avoided passing by that house. Something about it made us feel uncomfortable, as if the simple act of approaching could bring back that look of hatred that the woman had thrown at us from the window. As I grew up, the image of those children and the strange woman faded, like a nightmare one prefers to forget. However, every time I returned to visit my grandparents, I couldn't help but think about that house. My grandfather died a few years ago, taking with him his own secrets about that town, and my grandmother moved to the city shortly after. The town was left even more deserted than it already was. We never heard from that house or those children again. But recently, while reading about urban explorers and abandoned places, I came across a forum where they mentioned forgotten towns, and one described one almost like my grandparents. A user talked about a place he visited, where he claimed to have seen an old house with children playing outside. According to him, there was a figure hiding among a tree near the children, watching him, but he couldn't see who it was. He said that when he saw it, he felt a very heavy vibe around him, and something made him leave before something else happened. Reading that made me feel uncomfortable. I don't know if what we saw that afternoon were encounters with spirits from the past, a vision of an alternate reality, or something more sinister. But one thing is certain, there's something in that town that we can never explain. But my connection to that place didn't end there. Last summer, driven by a mixture of nostalgia and curiosity, I decided to return to the town after more than 15 years. I drove alone, wanting to see what remained of my childhood memories and perhaps find some closure about that mysterious house. The town looked even more abandoned than I remembered. Only 3 houses showed signs of life now, with thin wisps of smoke rising from their chimneys. I parked near where my grandparents' house used to be and walked through the empty streets, feeling like an intruder in a place that time had forgotten. As I approached the house where we had seen the children, my heart began to race. The building was in even worse condition now, with parts of the roof collapsed and vegetation growing through the broken windows. But as I stood there, taking in the decay, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in what used to be the front yard, I could see 3 small mounds of earth, each marked with a simple wooden cross that had been weathered by years of exposure to the elements. They looked like graves, child-sized graves. I approached them with trembling hands and found that someone had carved initials into each cross. MK, SK, and LK below the initials, barely legible, were dates from 1968 to 1971. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, an elderly woman appeared from one of the still inhabited houses. She moved slowly toward me, her cane tapping against the cracked pavement. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, but her voice carried a weight of warning. "I used to visit this town as a child," I explained. "I was curious about this house. I saw children here once, but my grandfather said it was abandoned." The old woman's expression grew sad and distant. "The Kowalski children," she whispered. "They died in the fire of '68. The whole family perished, but the children, their spirits never left. Some say they still play in that yard, waiting for their parents to come home." She looked at me with tired eyes. "Your grandfather knew the story. We all agreed never to speak of it to outsiders, especially not to children. It would have frightened you too much." As she spoke, I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized that what my brother and I had seen all those years ago wasn't our imagination. We had truly witnessed something beyond explanation. 3 children forever trapped in their innocence, playing in a yard that no longer existed in the world of the living. And that's why I prefer not to tell anyone where this town is. Some places hold on to their sorrows too tightly, and some stories are better left undisturbed. My name is Jonathan Pierce, and I'm a historian specializing in the American Old West. For over 15 years, I've traveled across the western United States, documenting the stories of boom towns and ghost towns that defined our nation's expansion. I've walked through countless abandoned settlements, each with its own tale of fortune and failure, but nothing prepared me for what I experienced in Bodie, California. Bodie was once one of the most notorious mining towns in the American West. In the 1870s and 80s, this remote settlement near the Nevada border was home to nearly 10,000 people, drawn by the promise of gold and silver. But Bodie was also known for its lawlessness murders, shootouts, and vigilante justice, were as common as the harsh winter storms that regularly cut the town off from the outside world. By the 1940s, Bodie was essentially abandoned. Its population dwindled to nothing as the mines played out, and easier opportunities called people elsewhere. The California State Park System eventually took over the town, preserving it in what they call a state of arrested decay, maintaining the buildings as they were found, but not restoring them to their original condition. I had visited Bodie several times during regular park hours, documenting the preserved buildings and researching the town's history in the archives. But I'd always felt there was something more to discover, something that couldn't be captured during the daylight hours when tour groups and casual visitors wandered through the streets. I wanted to experience Bodie as it truly was: silent, isolated, and haunted by its violent past. Through a special arrangement with the Park Service, I was granted permission to stay overnight in the town for research purposes. The park ranger, a weathered man named Ed Castellanos, who'd worked at Bodie for over 20 years, gave me a key to the visitor center and strict instructions about which buildings were off-limits due to structural concerns. "Just remember," Ed said as he prepared to leave me alone in the ghost town, "Bodie doesn't like to be disturbed. The old-timers who lived here after the mining days used to say the town had a memory of its own. Most folks who stay overnight here, well, let's just say they don't usually ask to do it again." I set up my equipment in the visitor center as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains. The silence was profound, no traffic, no modern sounds, just the whisper of wind through the wooden buildings and the occasional creak of weathered timber. I had planned to spend the evening reviewing historical documents and making notes, then explore the town by moonlight with my camera and recording equipment. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I organized my research materials and reviewed the tragic stories that had unfolded in this very location. Bodie had seen more than its share of violent shootouts in the streets, murders over mining claims, and the constant threat of claim jumpers and desperados. One particularly brutal incident involved a family of miners who had been found dead in their cabin, apparently killed by unknown assailants who were never caught. As the night deepened, I decided to venture out into the town. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows between the buildings and giving the empty streets an otherworldly appearance. I started with the main street, photographing the old saloons, the general store, and the assay office. The Methodist church stood at the end of the street, its steeple pointing toward the star-filled sky like an accusation. It was near midnight when I first heard the sounds. I was standing in front of the old schoolhouse, adjusting my camera settings, when I heard what sounded like voices coming from inside the building. They were faint, almost like whispers, but there was a conversational quality to them, as if people were talking quietly among themselves. I approached the schoolhouse cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The door was locked, just as Ed had left it, and peering through the windows revealed only empty desks and a dusty chalkboard. But the voices continued, seeming to come from within the walls themselves. I pressed my ear to the wooden door and listened. The voices were clearer now, and I could make out what sounded like children reciting lessons. A is for apple, B is for ball. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Then I heard something that froze my blood, the stern voice of a teacher correcting a student, followed by the sound of a ruler striking a desk. The voices continued for several minutes before gradually fading away, leaving me standing alone in the silence. I tried to rationalize what I'd heard. Perhaps it was the wind moving through the building in an unusual way, or sounds carrying from some distant source. But deep down, I knew what I'd experienced was something beyond normal explanation. I made notes in my journal and continued my exploration, telling myself that I was there to document history, not to be frightened by unexplained phenomena. Near the cemetery at the edge of town, I encountered something even more unsettling. As I walked among the weathered headstones, many marking the graves of those who had died violently in Bodie's heyday, I began to see figures moving between the markers. They were translucent, barely visible, like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement. Some appeared to be dressed in the clothing of the 1800s, long coats, bonnets, and work clothes stained with what looked like dirt or blood. One figure, a man in a dark coat and hat, seemed to notice my presence. He turned toward me, and though I couldn't make out his features clearly, I felt the weight of his gaze. He raised his hand as if to wave or signal to me, and I found myself taking a step backward. The figure stood there for a long moment before slowly fading from view, leaving me alone among the graves. I spent the rest of the night in the visitor center, but sleep was impossible. Every few minutes, I would hear footsteps on the wooden sidewalks outside, the sound of boots on weathered planks. When I looked out the windows, I saw nothing. But the footsteps continued throughout the night, sometimes seeming to pause directly outside the building, as if someone were listening at the door. Around 4 a.m, I heard something that nearly sent me running from the town entirely. From somewhere in the direction of the main street came the sound of piano music, the kind of lively, off-key melody you might hear in a frontier saloon. It was accompanied by laughter, conversation, and the clink of glasses. For nearly an hour, Bodie sounded like a living town again, full of the noise and energy of its mining camp days. When dawn finally came, the sounds faded away, leaving only the whisper of wind and the creak of old wood. Ed arrived shortly after sunrise to check on me, and I could tell from his expression that he knew something had happened. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a knowing smile. "Or maybe heard one. Bodie's full of them, you know. The old-timers used to say that violent deaths leave an impression on a place, like a photograph burned into the landscape. All that killing, all that anger and desperation, it doesn't just disappear when the people move on." I packed my equipment and prepared to leave, but before I got in my car, I took one last look at the town. In the bright morning sunlight, Bodie looked exactly as it had when I'd arrived, a collection of weathered buildings slowly returning to the earth. But I knew that when darkness fell again, the town would come alive with the echoes of its past. I returned to my university and wrote up my research, but I never mentioned the experiences I'd had that night. How could I? A historian's reputation is built on facts and evidence, not on ghost stories and unexplained phenomena. But I kept the notes I'd made during those dark hours, and sometimes I take them out and read them, remembering the night when I learned that some places hold onto their history in ways that can't be explained by science or reason. I've been back to Bodie many times since then, but always during the day, always with other people around. Some experiences are meant to happen only once, and some truths are too heavy to carry more than once in a lifetime. Bodie taught me that the past isn't always past. Sometimes it's still living, still breathing, still walking the streets of places where too much history soaked into the ground to ever truly be forgotten. The town sits there still, preserved in its state of arrested decay, welcoming visitors during the day and harboring its secrets after dark. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the moon is full, you can still hear the echo of piano music drifting across the desert, calling back to the days when Bodie was alive with the dreams and nightmares of the American frontier. This is the story of how my curiosity killed my 2 best friends and left me carrying a secret that has haunted me for over 20 years. If I had known then what I know now, I never would have suggested we explore the old Blackwood place. but teenage foolishness and the thrill of the unknown drove us to make a decision that would destroy everything. I grew up in Millbrook, a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it came to Victor Blackwood. The old man had lived alone in a cabin deep in the Adirondack woods for as long as anyone could remember, coming into town only once a month to buy supplies and collect his mail. He was strange, antisocial, and according to the locals, more than a little dangerous. Then 5 years ago, Victor Blackwood died. At least, that's what everyone believed. The story was that hikers had found his body in the woods, apparently the victim of a heart attack. The funeral was held at St. Andrew's Church, with a closed casket and only a handful of mourners. Victor was buried in Millbrook Cemetery with a simple granite headstone that read, Victor Blackwood, 1843 to 1998, rest in peace. But the rumors started almost immediately. People whispered that the body had been too decomposed to identify properly, that the coroner had made his determination based on the location and the clothes rather than any definitive evidence. Others claimed they'd seen lights in the windows of Victor's cabin months after his supposed death, or caught glimpses of a figure moving through the trees near his property. My friends Jake and Danny were as fascinated by these stories as I was. We were all 17, that perfect age where you think you're invincible and you're desperate to prove how brave you are. The mystery of Victor Blackwood became our obsession, especially after Jake's grandmother showed us an old photograph of the man taken at the town's centennial celebration. Victor Blackwood had been a striking figure, tall and lean, with piercing gray eyes and a full head of silver hair. Even in the faded photograph, there was something unsettling about his appearance, as if he was looking directly through the camera at whoever might be viewing the picture. We should go to his cabin, Danny suggested one evening as we sat in my garage, passing the photograph between us. See if the old bastard is really dead, or if he's still up there hiding from the world. Jake nodded enthusiastically. We know what he looks like now. If we see him, we'll know for sure if those stories are true. I should have said no. I should have told them it was a terrible idea, that we could get arrested for trespassing or worse. But the truth is, I wanted to know just as badly as they did. The mystery had gotten under my skin, and the possibility of being the ones to solve it was too tempting to resist. We planned our expedition for the following Saturday. Jake had a detailed topographical map that showed the location of Victor's cabin, about 8 miles into the woods, along an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in decades. We packed water, flashlights, and a camera, telling our parents we were going camping at Beaver Lake. The hike took us nearly 4 hours, following deer trails and creek beds through some of the most remote terrain in the region. The deeper we went into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around us, blocking out most of the sunlight and creating an eerie twilight even in the middle of the day. When we finally found the cabin, my first thought was that it looked exactly like the kind of place where a madman would live. The structure was old and weathered, built from logs that had darkened with age and moss. The windows were covered with wooden shutters, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris. Weeds had grown up around the foundation, and the clearing around the cabin was littered with rusted tools and broken furniture. But there were signs that someone had been there recently. The path to the front door was clear of vegetation, and when we got closer, we could see that the wooden steps had been repaired with fresh lumber. Most telling of all, there was a thin line of smoke rising from the stone chimney. "Someone's definitely living here," Jake whispered, his excitement overriding any sense of caution. We approached the front door and Danny knocked 3 times. No answer. We waited a full minute, then Danny knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Maybe he's out hunting or something," Jake suggested. "We could wait for him to come back." But I had a different idea. Or we could just take a quick look inside, see if it's really him, and then get out of here. The front door was unlocked, which should have been our first warning. We stepped inside and immediately noticed how clean everything was. The cabin was spartanly furnished but well maintained, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single bedroom visible through an open doorway. Everything was too normal, too tidy for a place that was supposed to be abandoned. We explored the main room first, looking for any evidence that Victor Blackwood was still alive. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace, we found what we were looking for: a small collection of photographs, including one that was clearly more recent than the others. It showed the same man from Jake's grandmother's photograph, but this picture had been taken within the last few years. Victor Blackwood was definitely not dead. The bedroom was where we found him. He was lying on a simple wooden bed, covered by a thick wool blanket. At first glance, he appeared to be sleeping peacefully, but there was something wrong with the scene. His skin was pale, not just pale, but almost gray, like old parchment. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and his cheeks were sunken, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. Danny reached out and touched the man's hand to check for a pulse. Victor Blackwood's eyes snapped open. In one fluid motion, he sat up and drove a hunting knife, which had been hidden beneath the blanket, directly into Danny's throat. Blood erupted from the wound like a fountain, spraying across the wall and sealing as Danny collapsed, gurgling and clutching at his neck. Jake and I screamed and ran for the door, but Victor was already moving. Despite his apparent frailty, he moved with the speed and coordination of a much younger man. He caught Jake in the main room and wrapped his hands around my friend's throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. I picked up a wooden chair and swung it as hard as I could at Victor's head. The chair shattered on impact, but he didn't even flinch. Instead, he grabbed one of the broken chair legs and turned toward me with murder in his eyes. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a harsh whisper. "You shouldn't have seen this." Jake's face was turning blue as Victor's grip tightened around his throat. I threw myself at the old man, pounding on his back with my fists, but it was like hitting a tree trunk. He was impossibly strong, unmovable. Within minutes, Jake stopped struggling. Victor released him, and my best friend's body crumpled to the floor like a discarded doll. I ran for the door, but Victor was right behind me. I could hear his footsteps on the wooden floor, steady and determined. He wasn't going to let me escape. He couldn't afford to have anyone know that he was still alive. I burst through the front door and sprinted toward the tree line, hoping to lose myself in the forest. But when I reached the edge of the clearing and looked back, Victor was standing on his front porch, watching me with those terrible gray eyes. He made no move to follow me into the woods. Instead, he simply stood there, letting me know that he had seen my face clearly and would remember it. The message was clear. If I ever told anyone what had happened, If I ever revealed that Victor Blackwood was still alive, he would come for me. I stumbled through the forest for hours, following the creek bed back toward town. When I finally emerged from the woods, I was covered in scratches and my clothes were torn, but I was alive. My friends were not. The hardest part was lying to their families. I told everyone that Jake and Danny had fallen into the rapids while we were exploring near Beaver Lake, that the current had swept them away before I could help them. Search teams looked for days, but never found the bodies, which made my story more believable. Only I knew that their bodies were buried somewhere in the deep woods, in graves that would never be found. A year later, Jake's family moved to California, unable to bear the memories that surrounded them in Millbrook. Danny's parents divorced, and his mother moved to Florida while his father started drinking heavily and eventually lost his job. I lived with the secret for 5 years, until I finally graduated high school and moved away to college. But even now, 20 years later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I've seen Victor Blackwood's face in my bedroom window, or catch glimpses of a tall figure watching me from across the street. I never went back to Millbrook, and I never told anyone the truth about what happened to my friends. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Victor Blackwood is still out there in his cabin, waiting for someone else to discover his secret. And I wonder if someday he'll decide that 20 years is long enough to wait for his revenge. My name is Alex Patterson, and I'm an independent journalist who specializes in investigating abandoned towns and their hidden histories. Over the years, I've traveled to countless ghost towns and deserted settlements, each with its own narrative of desolation and forgotten memories. However, one of my most unsettling journeys took me to Centralia, Pennsylvania, a coal mining town that's been burning underground for over 60 years. Most people know the surface story of Centralia, how an underground coal fire started in 1962 and never stopped burning, forcing residents to evacuate their homes. The official account speaks of an accidental fire that began at the town dump and spread to the coal seams beneath the ground. But what I discovered there challenged everything I thought I knew about this infamous ghost town. I arrived in Centralia on a cold October morning, driving through the rural Pennsylvania landscape dotted with remnants of America's industrial past. The town today is mostly empty lots and cracked pavement, with only a handful of residents still clinging to their homes despite the toxic gases seeping from the ground. Steam rises from cracks in the earth, and the smell of sulfur hangs heavy in the air. It's a place that feels cursed, abandoned by both God and government. My plan was to document the current state of the town, and if possible, uncover some previously unknown details about its demise. I'd done my research, read the official reports, but something about the timeline had always bothered me. The fire supposedly started from burning trash, but the rapid spread seemed unusual, even for a coal seam fire. While exploring the remnants of the town, I came across the old municipal building, partially collapsed, but still accessible. Inside, among water-damaged files and rusted filing cabinets, I found something unexpected, a collection of documents that had somehow survived decades of neglect. There were meeting minutes, inspection reports, and personal correspondence dating back to the late 1950s and early 1960s. That evening, in my motel room 20 miles away, I spread the documents across the bed and began to piece together what they revealed. The picture that emerged was far more troubling than the official story suggested. One document, a letter from a mine safety inspector named Robert Henderson, dated January 1962, described serious concerns about ventilation systems and gas accumulation in the eastern sector. Another file contained correspondence between town officials and the mining company, discussing cost-cutting measures that included reducing safety inspections and delaying equipment maintenance. A memo from the company's supervisor to the mine foreman, dated just 3 weeks before the fire, explicitly stated, "Continue operations despite minor gas readings. Production targets take priority." Most disturbing was a handwritten note tucked inside a folder marked confidential. It was from a miner named Thomas Sullivan to his brother, describing strange smells in the mine, equipment malfunctions, and workers reporting headaches and nausea. The date on the letter was May 15th, 1962, nearly 2 weeks before the official fire started at the dump. As I read through more documents, a pattern emerged that painted a very different picture of Centralia's tragedy. Multiple inspection reports from the months leading up to the fire documented dangerous levels of methane gas, inadequate ventilation, and repeated equipment failures. The mining company had been cutting corners, ignoring safety protocols, and suppressing reports of hazardous conditions. One particularly damning document was an internal company memo discussing the controlled burn method, a technique sometimes used to manage gas buildup in mines. The memo, dated May 20th, 1962, mentioned implementing emergency gas release procedures in Section 7, but warned about potential surface complications. The timeline was becoming clearer and more sinister. The fire hadn't started accidentally at the dump. It had begun underground, possibly as a result of the mining company's dangerous attempt to manage explosive gas buildup. The dump fire story appeared to be a cover-up, a way to shift blame from corporate negligence to municipal mismanagement. I spent the next day interviewing some of the elderly residents who still lived in the area. Most were reluctant to talk, but one woman, Eleanor Mackenzie, whose family had lived in Centralia for 3 generations, finally opened up. She remembered her father, a mine supervisor, coming home in the weeks before the fire with worried expressions and hushed phone conversations. "Dad knew something was wrong," she told me, her weathered hands gripping a cup of coffee. "He kept talking about cleaning up the mess before someone gets hurt, but then it was too late. After the fire started, he never talked about the mine again." None of them did. Eleanor also mentioned something that chilled me to the bone. Her father had told her family to stay away from certain areas of town in the days before the fire became public knowledge. He seemed to know exactly where the danger zones would be, as if the spread of the underground fire wasn't as random as everyone believed. I returned to the documents with this new information and found more evidence of a coordinated cover-up. There were payments made to several miners' families shortly after the fire, described as relocation assistance, but with no official paperwork to justify the amounts. There were also records of meetings between company executives and government officials that took place in the weeks following the fire, discussing containment of information and management of public perception. The final piece of the puzzle came from a conversation I had with retired Fire Chief Harold Morrison, who had been one of the first responders when the fire was officially discovered. Now in his 80s and suffering from lung disease, likely from exposure to the toxic gases, he agreed to meet with me at a diner outside of town. "We all knew the official story didn't add up," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. The fire was already too big, too spread out to have just started at the dump. It had been burning underground for weeks, maybe months. But the company had lawyers, and the government wanted it quiet. Small-town fire departments don't fight corporations and federal agencies. Harold described how the mining company had brought in their own specialists, who took control of the situation, limiting access to the fire sites and controlling the flow of information to the media. Local officials were pressured to stick to the official story, and anyone who asked too many questions was warned about interfering with federal emergency response. As I drove away from Centralia for the last time, the weight of what I'd discovered pressed down on me like the toxic gases that still seep from the ground. The town hadn't been destroyed by an accidental fire. It had been sacrificed to cover up corporate negligence and governmental complicity. Hundreds of families had lost their homes, their community, their entire way of life, not because of bad luck or municipal incompetence, but because a mining company chose profits over safety and then chose lies over accountability. The real fire in Centralia isn't just the coal burning beneath the ground. It's the burning truth that's been buried for over 60 years. The smoke that rises from the cracked pavement isn't just from burning coal. It's from the smoldering remains of trust, truth, and justice. I published my findings in several investigative journals, but the response was predictably muted. The mining company is long gone, dissolved into larger corporations with teams of lawyers. The government officials involved are mostly dead or retired. The statute of limitations has long since expired on any potential criminal charges. But Centralia itself remains, a smoking monument to the consequences of putting profit over people, of choosing convenient lies over inconvenient truths. The few residents who still call it home live above a fire that may burn for another 100 years or more. A fire that was lit not by accident, but by the deliberate actions of those who valued money more than human life. Sometimes the most haunting ghost towns are haunted not by spirits, but by the ghosts of choices that can never be undone, and truths that can never be fully buried, no matter how deep underground they're pushed. My name is David Rivers, and I'm a documentary photographer specializing in capturing the essence of forgotten places and abandoned locations. For the past decade, I've traveled across America seeking out those spaces that time has left behind, trying to tell their stories through my lens. My work has taken me to shuttered hospitals, empty factories, and countless ghost towns, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered in Bannack, Montana. I'd heard about Bannack through other photographers in the urban exploration community. Founded in 1862 during the Montana Gold Rush, Bannack had briefly served as the territorial capital before the gold played out, and the population moved on to other opportunities. Unlike many ghost towns that have crumbled into unrecognizable ruins, Bannack has been preserved as a state park. with over 60 buildings still standing in various states of preservation. What made Bannack particularly intriguing was its dark history. The town had been plagued by a gang of road agents, highway robbers, who preyed on miners and travelers carrying gold. The gang's leader was Henry Plummer, who had managed to get himself elected as the town sheriff, giving him perfect cover for his criminal activities. When the townspeople finally discovered the truth, they formed a vigilante committee that hanged Plummer and several of his associates from a makeshift gallows on the main street. I arrived in Bannack on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of day when the light is perfect for photography, clear and golden, with just enough contrast to bring out the textures in weathered wood and rusted metal. I'd arranged to spend several days in the area, camping nearby, and having full access to photograph the town during both daylight and the restricted evening hours. The first day went exactly as planned. I wandered through the preserved buildings, capturing images of the schoolhouse with its tiny desks still arranged in rows, the hotel with its faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, and the jail where Sheriff Plummer had once locked up his victims before his gang robbed them. Each building held its own stories, its own atmosphere of abandonment and memory. It was while photographing the Goodrich Hotel that I first noticed something unusual. The hotel, a two-story structure that had once been the finest accommodation in town, still contained much of its original furniture. I was working in what had been the dining room, adjusting my tripod to capture the way afternoon light fell across the dusty tables and chairs, when I saw movement in my peripheral vision. I looked up from my camera to see a curtain in one of the upstairs windows swaying gently, as if someone had just moved past it. The building had been locked when I arrived, and I hadn't seen any park staff since morning. I watched for several minutes, but the curtain remained still. I attributed it to air currents in the old building and continued working. That evening, I set up camp in the designated area just outside the town and spent time reviewing the day's photographs on my laptop. Most were exactly as I remembered taking them, atmospheric shots that captured the melancholy beauty of the abandoned settlement. But when I reached the images I'd taken in the hotel dining room, I noticed something that made me pause. In one of the photographs, clearly visible in the background through the doorway leading to the stairs, was a figure. It was indistinct, almost transparent, but unmistakably human in shape. The figure appeared to be wearing clothing from the 19th century, a long coat and what looked like a hat. It was positioned as if it had been walking across the hallway when I took the shot, but I was certain no one had been there when I pressed the shutter. I examined the image carefully, wondering if it could be a trick of light and shadow, or perhaps a reflection from somewhere else in the building. But the more I studied it, the more convinced I became that I had captured something that shouldn't have been there. I made a note in my journal and decided to return to the hotel the next day for a more thorough investigation. The second day brought clouds and intermittent rain, which actually enhanced the moody atmosphere I was trying to capture. I spent the morning photographing the exterior of various buildings, including the site where the gallows had stood during the vigilante days. According to historical records, 21 men had been hanged by the vigilantes, most of them members of Plummer's gang. In the afternoon, I returned to the Goodrich Hotel with a specific plan. I wanted to photograph the upstairs rooms, particularly the area where I'd seen the figure in the previous day's image. The hotel's second floor consisted of small guest rooms, most still containing iron bed frames and washstands. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and decay. I was setting up to photograph one of the rooms when I heard something that made me freeze. From somewhere else on the second floor came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and clearly moving from one room to another. I called out, thinking perhaps a park ranger was checking the building, but received no response. The footsteps continued for several minutes before stopping abruptly. I decided to investigate, moving carefully through the narrow hallway with my camera ready. I checked each room systematically, but found them all empty. The dust on the floors showed only my own footprints. But in the last room I checked, the one at the far end of the hall, I found something that chilled me to the bone. On the small table beside the window, someone had placed a single playing card, the Ace of Spades. The card looked old, yellowed with age, but it hadn't been there when I'd briefly looked into the room earlier. I photographed it in place, then carefully picked it up. The card felt genuine, not like a modern reproduction, and had the weight and texture of 19th century printing. The historical significance wasn't lost on me. According to local legends, the Ace of Spades had been Henry Plummer's calling card. He would leave one at the scene of his robberies as a signature. Finding one in the hotel, where he'd likely stayed during his time in Bannack, felt like more than coincidence. I spent the rest of the afternoon photographing the card and the room where I'd found it, documenting everything carefully. As evening approached and the light began to fade, I prepared to leave the hotel and return to my camp. But as I descended the stairs, I heard something that made me stop mid-step. From the dining room came the sound of conversation, multiple voices talking quietly, the clink of glasses, and what sounded like chairs being moved across the floor. It was as if the hotel had suddenly come to life, filled with guests from another era. I stood on the staircase, listening to the sounds of a dinner party that couldn't possibly be happening. I crept down the remaining steps and peered into the dining room. The space was empty, the tables and chairs exactly as I'd left them. But the sounds continued: laughter, conversation, the scrape of cutlery against plates. I raised my camera and began taking photographs, shooting blindly into the apparently empty room, hoping to capture something that might explain what I was hearing. The sounds continued for nearly 20 minutes before gradually fading away, leaving only the silence of the abandoned building. I left quickly, my hands shaking as I packed my equipment. That night, I sat in my tent reviewing the photographs I'd taken during the mysterious dinner party. In several of the images, I could make out faint figures seated around the dining room tables. They were translucent, like multiple exposures, but clearly human in form. Men in suits and women in long dresses, all apparently from the 1800s. In one particularly clear image, I could see the face of a man seated at the head table. A bearded face with hard eyes that seemed to be looking directly at the camera. Later research would confirm what I suspected. The face belonged to Henry Plummer himself, based on the few photographs that exist of the outlaw sheriff. Somehow, I'd captured an image of Bannack's most notorious resident, apparently still holding court in the hotel where he'd once planned his crimes. I stayed in Bannack for 2 more days, but avoided the hotel entirely. Instead, I focused on the other buildings, capturing what I thought would be safer subjects. But even in the schoolhouse and the church, my photographs continued to reveal figures that hadn't been visible to the naked-eye children at desks, that should have been empty, congregation members in pews that had been vacant for over a century. On my final evening, I decided to visit the site of the original gallows. Historical markers indicated where the structure had stood, where the vigilantes had dispensed their rough justice to Plummer and his gang. I set up my tripod as the sun set behind the mountains, hoping to capture one final image of this significant location. As I focused my camera on the marker, I saw them translucent figures standing in a rough circle around the gallows site. Some appeared to be the vigilantes themselves, while others seemed to be the condemned men, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. In the center of the group stood a figure I recognized from my hotel photographs, Henry Plummer, his face bearing an expression of defiant rage even in death. I took several photographs before the figures began to fade with the last light of day. When I reviewed the images later, they showed the execution seen as clearly as if it had happened yesterday rather than over a century and a half ago. The faces of both the executed and their executioners were clearly visible, frozen in a moment of violent justice that had left its mark on the very landscape of Bannack. I left Montana the next morning, my memory cards full of images that defied rational explanation. Back home, I spent weeks processing and studying the photographs, trying to understand what I'd experienced. The images were technically perfect, proper exposure, sharp focus, good composition. But they documented events that were impossible, people who had been dead for generations. I've never publicly shared the most disturbing images from Bannack. How could I? My reputation as a photographer depends on documenting reality, not creating elaborate hoaxes or encouraging ghost stories. But I keep the photographs in a special folder on my computer, and sometimes I look through them, remembering the town where the past refused to stay buried. I've been back to Bannack twice since that first visit, always during regular daytime hours with other people around. The town looks exactly the same, weathered buildings slowly returning to the earth, preserved in their state of historic authenticity. But I know that when darkness falls and the tourists leave, Bannack comes alive with the echoes of its violent past. The ace of spades I found in the hotel room sits framed on my desk, a reminder that some places hold onto their history in ways that transcend our understanding of time and reality. And sometimes, late at night when I'm processing photographs in my darkroom, I think I can hear the faint sound of voices from another era, telling stories that were never meant to be forgotten. My grandfather was never one for words. He was a man who had lived through too much to worry about what others thought. He never liked talking about the place where he was born. In fact, he avoided mentioning it altogether. As a curious child, I would ask him questions about his childhood and family, but he would always shut down and refuse to share. It wasn't until I turned 18, when he was already an elderly man with distant eyes full of unspoken pain, that he finally told me what happened when he came into this world. He told it without emotion, as if sharing the story was a heavy burden he needed to release before it was too late. This is the story he told me. My grandfather was born in a town that, according to him, no longer exists. A place that doesn't appear on maps or travel routes. A town of adobe houses, dirt roads, and an atmosphere so heavy that every dawn felt ominous. A place governed not by laws, but by a group of women that everyone knew as the witches. These were women who, it was said, had the power to shape reality at will, making deals with forces that no sensible person would dare mention. No one in the town spoke openly about them, but everyone knew they were there, watching hidden in the shadows. People believed these women could smell newborns and pregnant women from miles away. It was common to hear that if a baby was born in the town, no more than a few days would pass before it disappeared without a trace. The stories told that the witches kidnapped them, using them in dark rituals to maintain their youth and seal pacts with powerful entities. In their desperation, some parents even voluntarily handed them over in exchange for favors, more abundant crops, more livestock, or simply a life a little less miserable. The town was trapped under the control of these women. My great-grandparents, like others, lived in constant fear of being next. But when my great-grandmother found out she was pregnant, she decided that her child would not become an offering to those creatures. My grandfather hadn't even been born yet when they began plotting their escape. They knew they couldn't simply leave, as the witches watched every exit, and if they detected the scent of a pregnant woman, it was almost certain they would capture her. With what little they had, my great-grandparents managed to contact a man who transported cattle between towns and larger cities. This man, of few words and dubious reputation, agreed to help them in exchange for an amount that, for them, represented everything they had saved in their lifetime. However, it was the only way to save their son. The plan was dangerous and risky. My great-grandmother hid among the cattle, covered with manure and straw to disguise her scent, while my great-grandfather was in charge of distracting any attention they might attract. During the night before leaving, the anxiety in the house was palpable. My great-grandmother could barely breathe, terrified that the witches would appear before they managed to escape. With every sound coming from outside, her hands gripped her belly tighter, silently praying that her child would reach a safe place. That night, as the cart moved along the dusty roads leading out of town, my great-grandmother listened to the lowing of the cattle and the heavy steps of the horses pulling the cart. She knew that any mistake could be fatal. If the witches discovered them, they would not only take her child, but probably condemn them all. She felt something watching her from the trees alongside the road, but forced herself not to look, fearful of what she might find if she did. The journey was long and tense, but in the end they reached their destination. A distant city where stories about witches and black magic didn't hold the same power as in their old town. There, far from the watchful eyes of those women, my grandfather was able to be born safely. My grandfather said that was the only time his mother spoke of her old life, and from that day on they did everything possible to forget. They changed their names and never mentioned the town or the witches again. However, there was always something that reminded them of where they came from. Sometimes the paranoia of believing someone was watching them, seeing shadows out of the corner of their eyes in the darkness of night, or even disturbing dreams. Sometimes at nightfall, my great-grandmother would wake up trembling, claiming to have heard whispers, voices of women cursing her son and his existence. Over time, they learned that the town had been abandoned. The people who tried to escape, like my great-grandparents, gradually left one by one. Those who stayed no longer had children because the fear was too great. In the end, the houses were left empty, and the witches, if they were still there, disappeared among the ruins. Unfortunately, the story didn't end there. The few who have returned say that place is still alive, but in a dark and macabre way. Some explorers have tried to enter the town, only to run away after a few minutes. They say the atmosphere there is unbearable, as if the very air is charged with malevolent energy. There are those who claim to have seen dying-looking old women emerge from the forest, watching them from afar, just as the witches used to do with newborns. Others say they have been attacked by stones that came from nowhere, as if the town didn't want anyone to step on its cursed lands again. One of the most disturbing stories is that of a group of young people who, a few years ago, decided to camp near the place. They did it as a challenge, to prove they didn't believe in the stories that were told. But that very night, something strange happened. One of them wandered away from the camp, drawn by a figure he thought he saw among the trees. The others, worried, went after him, but couldn't find him. Only at dawn did they find him in a state of shock, unable to speak. His eyes were bulging and his hands trembling. When they brought him back to the city, all he could say was that he had seen a woman with black eyes, dressed in rags, watching him from a distance, and beginning to walk on all fours, almost crawling, approaching him. The story of that town has been buried in oblivion, just like the people who once lived there. My grandfather always warned me never to try to find that place, that some secrets are better left where they belong. And although that town is now empty, something tells me the witches never left. They may not be alive, but what they did in life bound them forever to that place, condemned to watch from the shadows those who dare to defile their land. Those pacts, those lives they took, are not easily forgotten. But my story doesn't end with my grandfather's tale. Years later, when I was already an adult, I found myself drawn to research abandoned places and ghost towns. I had never forgotten the story my grandfather told me, and part of me always wondered if such a place could really exist. I spent months researching, looking through old records, historical documents, anything that could give me a clue about that cursed town. It was during this research that I came across something that chilled my blood. In a dusty archive in a small library in New Mexico, I found references to a settlement that had been mysteriously abandoned in the early 1900s. The description matched my grandfather's story almost perfectly. A remote town, stories of disappearing children, and residents who fled in terror. But what really shook me was finding a newspaper clipping from 1923. The headline read, "Family found dead on desert road, mysterious circumstances surround tragedy." The article described how a family of 3 had been found dead in their wagon, apparently while trying to flee from an unnamed settlement. The woman was pregnant, and there were signs that she had given birth shortly before her death, but no baby was found. The article mentioned that locals refused to speak about the incident, and that the family had been trying to escape from what they called the cursed women of the hills. Reading those words, I felt my grandfather's presence, as if he was standing behind me, whispering that some doors should never be opened. I never continued that research. I burned the newspaper clipping and decided that my grandfather's warning was one I should heed. Some stories are meant to stay buried, and some places are meant to remain lost forever. My name is Thomas, and I need to tell you about the night that should have killed me. The night I learned that some places in this world harbor things that should never be disturbed. What started as a simple visit to a local healer for my hangover nearly became my final encounter with the living. And if my cousin hadn't arrived when he did, I wouldn't be here to share this story. I was 28 then, living in the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, Colorado, where I developed a serious drinking problem after losing my job at the lumber mill. For 3 straight days, I'd been on a bender that took me to every bar in town and left me sleeping rough in alleyways and under bridges. My family was fed up with my behavior, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. When I finally dragged myself home on the 4th morning, I was in bad shape. My mother took one look at me and started preparing soup and coffee, convinced that I'd poisoned myself with bad liquor or drugs. The hangover was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Not just the usual headache and nausea, but a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that made me feel like I was dying from the inside out. By the following evening, I was worse instead of better. My mother, a practical woman who'd raised 5 children mostly by herself, decided I needed more help than she could provide. "There's a healer woman lives up in Whispering Pine Forest," she told me as she helped me into the truck. "Alina Vasquez. She's helped half the town with ailments the doctors couldn't fix. We're going to see her before this gets any worse." The drive took us deep into the national forest, following a winding dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. After about 40 minutes, we reached a small clearing where an old log cabin sat surrounded by herb gardens and wind chimes made from bones and metal scraps. Alina Vasquez was exactly what I'd expected. An elderly Hispanic woman with silver-streaked hair and knowing eyes, wearing layers of colorful shawls and jewelry that clinked when she moved. She took one look at me and nodded knowingly. "Bad spirits in the alcohol," she said in accented English. "They follow you home, make you sick in ways the body cannot heal alone. Come, we will fix this." She led me to a small building behind the main cabin, more of a shed really, made from rough-hewn planks and roofed with corrugated metal. Inside, it was set up like a traditional healer's workshop, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and glass jars filled with various powders and tinctures lining the shelves. "Your mother will return for you in 2 hours," Alina told me, guiding me to a simple cot in the center of the room. I must go gather fresh ingredients from the forest. Rest here, and do not leave this building until I return. My mother left to visit my cousin Maria, who lived about 20 minutes away, and I was alone in the healer's workshop. The combination of exhaustion and whatever toxins were still in my system made me drowsy, and despite the unfamiliar surroundings, I found myself drifting off to sleep. I woke up when I heard the door creak open. "Alina," I called out, sitting up on the cot and rubbing my eyes. "Did you find what you needed?" The woman who entered wasn't Alina Vasquez. This woman was younger, maybe in her 30s, with the kind of otherworldly beauty that you see in movies, but never in real life. Her skin was pale as porcelain and seemed to glow with its own inner light. Her hair was black as midnight and fell in perfect waves to her waist. She wore a simple white dress that looked like it had been tailored by angels. Alina had to go further into the forest, the woman said, her voice like honey and silk. She sent me to begin your treatment. I am her apprentice. Something felt wrong about this, but I was still groggy and sick, and the woman's beauty was mesmerizing. She moved with fluid grace as she lit several candles around the room and closed the shutters over the windows. For the healing to work properly, she explained, we need darkness and concentration. The spirits that poison you are afraid of shadows. They hide better in bright light. The room was now lit only by flickering candle flames, creating dancing shadows on the walls. The woman moved around the space, seemingly preparing something, but I couldn't see what she was doing in the dim light. When she turned around to face me, my blood turned to ice. The beautiful woman was gone. In her place stood something from a nightmare. Her skin had turned black as charcoal, cracked and burned-looking, as if she'd been pulled from a fire. The perfect features were now twisted and grotesque, with deep sores covering her face and neck. Her lustrous hair had fallen out in patches, leaving her scalp mottled and diseased. Worst of all, her mouth had become a gaping hole, filled with rotting gums. Not a single tooth remained. I tried to scream, but only a choking sound came out. I attempted to get up from the cot, but my legs wouldn't support me. The creature moved toward me with inhuman speed, covering the distance between us in the blink of an eye. Her hands, now more like claws, grabbed me by the chest and threw me to the floor with impossible strength. The impact knocked the wind out of me and left me gasping like a fish out of water. In the dim candlelight, I could no longer see her clearly, but I could feel her presence hovering over me. Then invisible hands wrapped around my throat. I couldn't see what was strangling me, but the grip was real and tightening by the second. I clawed at my own neck, trying to pry away fingers that weren't there, gasping for air that wouldn't come. My vision started to go dark around the edges, and I knew I was seconds away from losing consciousness. I was going to die in this godforsaken shed, killed by something that shouldn't exist. That's when I heard my cousin Roberto calling my name from outside. Tommy, Tommy, where are you? Your mother sent me to check on you. The moment Roberto's voice penetrated the walls of the shed, the invisible hands released my throat. I sucked in air desperately, coughing and retching as oxygen flooded back into my lungs. The candles flickered as if blown by a sudden wind, and when the flames steadied, I was alone. Roberto burst through the door 30 seconds later, finding me on the floor, gasping and clutching at my throat. The real Elena Vasquez was right behind him, carrying a basket of herbs and looking genuinely confused. "What happened here?" she demanded, looking around the shed with sharp eyes. "Why are the candles lit? Why are you on the floor?" I tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out in a jumbled rush. Elena listened carefully, her expression growing more serious with each detail I provided. "Describe the woman who claimed to be my apprentice," she said when I finished. I told her about the beautiful woman who had transformed into the burned creature, and Elena nodded grimly. "You were very lucky," she said. "What you encountered was not human. There are things in these woods, old things, that feed on human souls. They can take any form they choose, but their true nature is always evil." She showed me the scratches on my neck, deep gouges, that formed perfect fingerprints, as if invisible claws had tried to tear my throat out. "This forest has a dark history," Elena continued, as she treated my wounds with herbs and oils. "Decades ago, before the government made this area a national forest. It was private land owned by a man named Cornelius Blackthorne. He was a wealthy industrialist from back east who came here in the 1890s, claiming he wanted to build a logging empire. She paused in her work, her weathered hands gentle as she applied a salve to the scratches on my neck. But Blackthorne wasn't interested in lumber. He was part of a cult that practiced dark magic, human sacrifice, summoning of demons. They built an altar deep in these woods, in a place where the trees grow so thick that sunlight never touches the ground. For over 20 years, they killed people there, travelers, drifters, anyone who wouldn't be missed. Roberto helped me sit up as Alina continued her story. When the authorities finally discovered what was happening, they found the remains of more than 60 people scattered throughout the forest. Blackthorne and his followers were arrested, tried, and executed, but the damage was done. The things they summoned, the evil they invited into this place, it never left. She gestured toward the door of the shed, where I could see the real forest beyond, dark and seemingly innocent in the evening light. The creatures that live here now can take any form, appear as anyone you might trust. They feed on human life force, human souls. Most people who encounter them don't survive because they don't have someone like your cousin to interrupt the feeding. I touched the bandages she'd applied to my neck, feeling the sting of the scratches beneath them. "How did you know?" I asked. "How did you know what it was?" Alina smiled sadly. "Because this has happened before. 3 times in the past 15 years, people have come to me for healing and encountered the same creature. 2 of them died before help arrived. You are only the second person to survive." Roberto helped me to my feet, and I found that I could stand without difficulty. The terrible exhaustion that had plagued me for days was gone, replaced by a nervous energy that made me want to get as far away from this place as possible. "The hangover," I said, suddenly realizing that I felt completely normal for the first time in days. "It's gone." "The creature fed on your sickness," Alina explained. "It was drawn to your weakened state, your vulnerability. In a way, it did heal you. It just planned to take your life in exchange." We left the forest that night and never looked back. True to Alina's words, my drinking problem seemed to disappear along with the hangover. Whether it was fear of encountering that thing again or simply the shock of nearly dying, I haven't touched alcohol since that night. Roberto drove me home, and we agreed never to tell the rest of the family what had really happened. The official story was that Alina had given me some herbs that made me sick before they made me better, and that I'd had a bad reaction that left me with some scratches. But sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed, I think about that beautiful woman with the glowing skin and perfect features. I wonder how many other people she's appeared to, how many victims she's claimed in the decades since Blackthorne's cult opened that doorway between worlds. And I wonder what would have happened if Roberto had been just 5 minutes later, if those invisible hands had finished their work before help arrived. The real Alina Vasquez moved away from Pine Ridge 6 months after my encounter, selling her property to the Forest Service and relocating to New Mexico. Before she left, she stopped by my house to give me a small pouch filled with herbs and salt. "Keep this with you," she told me. "The creature knows your scent now, knows the taste of your fear. It may try to find you again someday, especially if you venture into dark places alone." I still carry that pouch, even though I moved to Denver 2 years ago and now work in an office building surrounded by concrete and steel. Because I've learned that some hungers never fade, some predators never forget, and some places in this world are best left undisturbed. The forest is still there, of course. Whispering Pine National Forest attracts thousands of hikers and campers every year, most of whom have wonderful, peaceful experiences in the wilderness. But every so often, someone goes missing. Every so often, a hiker is found dead under mysterious circumstances, with injuries that don't match any known animal attack. The rangers blame bears or mountain lions, and maybe sometimes they're right. But I know better. I know that something else prowls those woods, something that wears familiar faces and speaks with trusted voices, something that feeds on human souls in the shadow of trees that never see the sun. If you ever find yourself in the Colorado Rockies, if you ever decide to explore the deep wilderness areas where the old maps show blank spaces, remember my story. Remember that not everything that appears human actually is human, and not every offer of help comes from a place of kindness. Some healers cure your ailments by taking them into themselves. Others cure them by taking everything you have to give, including your life. The trick is knowing the difference before it's too late. I was lucky enough to learn that lesson and live to tell about it. Most people aren't so fortunate. My name is David, and I work as a geological surveyor. My job has taken me to some of the most remote corners of the American Southwest, from the slot canyons of Utah to the hidden valleys of New Mexico. I've spent weeks alone in places where the nearest human being might be 100 miles away, and I've always found comfort in the solitude. But what I'm about to tell you happened in Colorado 3 years ago, and it's something that still haunts me every single day. I was contracted to conduct a mineral survey in the San Juan Mountains, in an area so remote it didn't appear on most tourist maps. The nearest town was a tiny Hispanic community called Esperanza, population maybe 200 people, nestled in a valley that seemed untouched by the modern world. The residents were incredibly welcoming, offering me a place to stay and home-cooked meals. But I noticed they were reluctant to discuss certain parts of the surrounding wilderness. From the very beginning, they warned me away from one particular area, a network of old mining trails they called El Sendero Perdido, the Lost Trail. According to local folklore, it was a place of bad luck, where miners had disappeared in the 1800s and strange things still happen to this day. They wouldn't give me specifics, but their fear was genuine and absolute. Being a man of science, I initially dismissed their concerns as superstition. However, as days passed and I continued my survey work, my curiosity about the forbidden area grew stronger. Every time I mentioned it, conversations would abruptly end or people would cross themselves and change the subject. This only made me more determined to see what was up there. One morning, while reviewing topographical maps in my rented room, I noticed that the Lost Trail area corresponded with some interesting geological formations that would be perfect for my research. I decided to explore it, despite knowing the locals would disapprove. I packed my equipment and headed out early, without telling anyone where I was going. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with scrub oak and mountain mahogany. After hiking for about 2 hours through increasingly difficult terrain, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Scattered throughout the area were small cairns, carefully stacked stones arranged in perfect circles. Some were recent, others looked ancient, weathered by decades of mountain storms. As I continued deeper into the canyon, I found melted candle stubs, animal bones arranged in geometric patterns, and wooden figures carved with disturbing detail, faces twisted in agony. Limbs bent at impossible angles. This wasn't what I had expected to find on a geological survey, but something compelled me to keep exploring. Finally, I reached a natural amphitheater where the canyon walls rose steeply on three sides. The ground was covered with a thick layer of ash, and the air smelled of old smoke and something else, something organic and decay. Branches had been deliberately woven together to form human-like shapes that hung from the few scraggly trees, swaying in the mountain breeze like macabre puppets. I felt like an intruder in a sacred space, but not a holy one. The silence in that place was absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even the normal mountain sounds seemed muffled and distant. I took a few quick soil samples and decided to get out of there before something bad happened. When I returned to Esperanza that evening, I immediately noticed a change in how people looked at me. Some averted their eyes, others stared with a mixture of fear and anger. No one would speak to me directly, and the woman who had been bringing me meals left my dinner on the doorstep instead of inviting me to her kitchen table as usual. That night, I was awakened by a low murmuring sound coming from outside my window. I turned off the lights and peered through the curtains to see something that made my heart stop. A group of people was standing in the street in front of my building, completely motionless and silent. They all wore wooden masks, crude, hand-carved faces that looked remarkably similar to the figures I had found on the lost trail. They stood there for what felt like hours, occasionally moving positions, but never making a sound. I couldn't tell if they were looking at my window or just standing vigil, but their presence was deeply unsettling. Eventually, they dispersed as silently as they had arrived, leaving me to wonder if I had imagined the entire thing. The next morning, I tried to engage some of the locals in conversation about what I had witnessed, but they all avoided me. The only person willing to speak was an elderly man who sold newspapers from a small kiosk near the church. He looked at me with what seemed like genuine pity and said, "They told you not to go up there. Now they know you've been marked." I didn't understand what he meant by marked, but something in his tone sent chills down my spine. I decided it was time to pack up and leave Esperanza as quickly as possible. As I was loading my truck that afternoon, a middle-aged woman approached me with a small package wrapped in red cloth. She pressed it into my hands and said urgently, "Take this with you, but don't open it until you're far from here. If you want to keep living your life, do exactly as I say." I wanted to ask her what was in the package, but she was already walking away. Her final words to me were, "Some places change you just by being there. You brought something back with you that should have stayed buried." I left Esperanza that same day, driving straight through to Denver with a growing sense of dread. When I finally felt safe enough to stop, I opened the woman's package in my hotel room. Inside was a carved wooden figure that looked exactly like me, same beard, same field clothes, even the same backpack I had been carrying on the lost trail. The level of detail was incredible and terrifying. I don't know how they created such an accurate likeness or what it was supposed to represent. All I know is that since that day, I've felt like I'm being watched constantly. I catch glimpses of figures in my peripheral vision that disappear when I turn to look. I hear footsteps behind me on empty streets. My dreams are filled with images of that ash-covered amphitheater and the swaying wooden puppets. Sometimes I think it was my own fault for ignoring the warnings, but other times I wonder if I was meant to find that place. Either way, I know now that the mountains hold secrets that are better left undisturbed. There are rituals and beliefs older than our country, older than our understanding, and some of them should remain hidden in the darkness where they belong. I've considered going back to Esperanza to try to understand what happened to me, but I'm afraid of what I might discover. Some knowledge comes with a price that's too high to pay, and some doors should never be opened. The wooden figure sits on my desk as I write this, a constant reminder that I brought something back from that cursed trail, something that may never let me go. My name is Marcus, and I don't usually talk about what happened to me 4 years ago in the forests of northern Michigan. It's the kind of experience that changes you, that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. But I need to tell someone, and maybe writing it down will help me make sense of it all. It started when my childhood friend Samuel reached out to me through social media after years of no contact. He had inherited his great uncle's cabin deep in the Upper Peninsula wilderness, and he insisted I come visit for a week. The place was supposed to be incredible, completely isolated, surrounded by thousands of acres of old-growth forest. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity to escape the chaos of Detroit and reconnect with an old friend. When I arrived in late September, everything seemed normal enough. Samuel met me at the tiny town of Copper Falls, population 312, and we drove another 40 minutes down increasingly rough logging roads to reach the cabin. The place was rustic but charming, built sometime in the 1930s with massive pine logs and a stone chimney that dominated one wall. The nearest neighbor was supposedly 15 miles away. The locals in town had been friendly but reserved, which I expected in a place that small. However, something about their behavior struck me as odd. Whenever I mentioned the forest or asked about hiking trails in the area, they would get nervous and quickly change the subject. One old-timer at the general store, a weathered man with hands like leather, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Don't go walking in them woods after dark, son. And if you see lights moving between the trees, you stay inside and don't look too close." At first, I figured it was just local folklore, the kind of stories small communities tell to keep outsiders from wandering into dangerous terrain. Samuel seemed reluctant to discuss it, and when I pressed him about it, he just shrugged and said the locals were superstitious about everything. "These old-timers have been telling the same ghost stories for generations," he said, dismissing my concerns. The first few days were peaceful. We spent our time fishing on the small lake behind the cabin, chopping firewood, and catching up on the years we'd lost touch. But as the nights grew longer and darker, I started noticing things that made my skin crawl. The forest would come alive after sunset. I'd hear sounds I couldn't identify, not quite animal, not quite human. And several times, when I looked out the cabin windows, I saw small points of light moving between the trees. At first, I thought they might be fireflies, but they were too large and moved in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like a group of people walking with lanterns. One evening, about 5 days into my stay, everything changed. We were playing cards by candlelight when the power went out, apparently a common occurrence in that remote area. Samuel didn't seem surprised. He just lit a few more candles and suggested we call it an early night. But as we sat there in the flickering light, I walked over to the window and saw the lights again. This time, they were much closer and much brighter, moving in what looked like a procession through the trees. "Hey, Samuel," I called out, "what do you think that is?" His expression changed instantly. He jumped up from the table and grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the window. "Marcus, listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice deadly serious. "Do not go outside. No matter what you see or hear tonight, do not leave this cabin." My curiosity got the better of me, of course. I told him I was just going to take a quick look around, but he gripped my shoulder harder and said, "You don't understand. Those aren't what you think they are. The locals call them the wandering ones, and they say anyone who follows those lights never comes back the same. Some don't come back at all." I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to scare me, and grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter. Against his protests, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was freezing, and an unnatural silence had fallen over the forest. I walked toward the tree line, where the mysterious lights seemed to be dancing between the trunks. As I got closer, I could hear what sounded like whispering, multiple voices speaking in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out any words. The lights moved in response to my approach, retreating deeper into the woods as if they were leading me somewhere. Against every instinct in my body, I followed them. The whispering grew louder, and I realized it wasn't in any language I recognized. It sounded ancient, almost musical, but there was something deeply wrong about it. I must have walked for 20 minutes, completely mesmerized, when the whispering suddenly changed to laughter. It was the most disturbing sound I'd ever heard, not quite human, but definitely intelligent. For the first time, real fear crept into my chest. I decided I'd gone far enough and turned to head back to the cabin. That's when I saw them. At least 6 figures standing between the trees, perfectly still, watching me. They were taller than any person should be, and something about their proportions was all wrong. When I aimed my flashlight at them, they moved with impossible speed, gliding between the shadows like smoke. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through underbrush and branches, certain that something was pursuing me. When I finally burst through the cabin door, Samuel was waiting with a rifle in his hands. "I told you not to go out there," was all he said before barring the door with a heavy piece of timber. We spent the rest of the night huddled inside while the laughter continued outside, sometimes close to the windows, sometimes distant. Samuel sat in a corner, clutching a wooden cross and muttering prayers under his breath. I had never seen him so terrified. The next morning, after I apologized profusely for my stupidity, I begged Samuel to explain what was really going on. He told me that according to the local Ojibwe traditions, the lights in the forest weren't human at all. They were something much older, something that had been in those woods since long before the first Europeans arrived. Some called them spirits of the dead. Others believed they were demons that fed on human curiosity and fear. He said he knew people who had encountered the lights over the years. Some had simply disappeared, their bodies never found. Others had returned to town, but they were changed hollow-eyed and speaking in whispers about things that couldn't exist in the rational world. A few had been found days later, wandering the forest in a catatonic state, with no memory of what had happened to them. After hearing all of this, I knew my vacation was over. I packed my bags that afternoon and drove straight back to Detroit, not stopping until I was safely back in the city. I haven't returned to Michigan's Upper Peninsula since, and I don't plan to. I still have nightmares about those lights, about the figures I saw between the trees. Sometimes I wake up convinced I can hear that alien laughter echoing through my apartment. I know now that there are places in this world that humans weren't meant to explore. Places where the old rules don't apply, and the darkness has teeth. If you ever find yourself in a remote forest and see unexplained lights moving through the trees, take my advice. Turn around and walk away. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some doors should never be opened. The cost of curiosity might be higher than you're willing to pay. When I was growing up in our small town in rural Montana, whispers followed Father McKenna wherever he went. He'd been at St. Mary's for over 15 years, which was unusual since most priests were rotated every 3 or 4 years. The parish staff spoke of him only in hushed tones, if at all, as though they'd been sworn to secrecy or were simply too afraid to speak freely. What made the rumors worse was the pattern everyone noticed, but no one dared discuss openly. Once every 6 weeks, like clockwork, someone would disappear. Always a young woman, always between the ages of 16 and 25. The official explanations varied: family troubles, running away to the city, joining relatives in other states. But the timing was too consistent to be coincidence. I was 17 that autumn night when everything changed. My parents had gone to bed early, and I was in our living room reading Stephen King's The Stand, a book my father had reluctantly bought me for my birthday. Our house sat on Maple Street, and from my spot by the front window, I could see clearly down to the intersection where the church stood. It was past midnight when I saw him. A figure in clerical clothes walking with quick, nervous steps, constantly looking over his shoulder. Even from a distance, something seemed off about his appearance. His face looked different somehow, darker, more angular than I remembered. My curiosity got the better of me. I quietly slipped out the front door and followed him from the shadows, using the old oak trees that lined our streets as cover. To my surprise, instead of heading deeper into town, he walked straight toward Miller's Woods, the dense forest that bordered our community. I'd hunted there with my father countless times, but never at night, and certainly never following someone who clearly didn't want to be seen. The forest sounds: owls hooting, branches creaking, small animals rustling through the undergrowth, helped mask my footsteps as I trailed behind him. Twice I thought he might have heard me, but he never turned around. After what felt like an hour of hiking deeper into the woods, we reached a clearing I'd never seen before. The sight that greeted me there will haunt me for the rest of my life. Torches mounted on wooden stakes formed a circle around the clearing, casting dancing shadows that made everything look hellish. 7 or 8 people stood in the flickering light, all wearing black robes with hoods pulled up. I recognized some of them, even with their faces partially hidden: Mrs. Patterson, who played the organ, young Tommy Martinez, who served as an altar boy, Mr. Henderson, who collected the offerings each Sunday. In the center of the circle, lying on what looked like a makeshift altar covered in white cloth, was a girl I recognized from the high school. Sarah Brennan, a senior who'd been missing for 3 days. Her parents had been frantically searching, putting up flyers all over town. But Sarah wasn't dead. She was something far worse. Her eyes had rolled back, showing only white, and her mouth hung open, thick saliva dripping down her chin and soaking her torn dress. Her body convulsed and twisted in ways that seemed to defy human anatomy. When Father McKenna approached her, holding a large silver crucifix, she began to emit sounds that no human throat should be able to make, deep, guttural growls mixed with what sounded like multiple voices speaking at once. The priest began reciting Latin phrases from an old leather-bound book, sprinkling holy water on Sarah's writhing form. Where the water touched her skin, steam rose up as if it were acid, and her inhuman screams grew louder. I pressed my back against a pine tree, my legs shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. Then Sarah began to levitate. Her body rose 3 feet off the altar, suspended in midair with no visible support. The robed figures stepped back, some clutching their crucifixes so tightly their knuckles were white. Father McKenna continued his chanting, his voice growing more forceful, more desperate. That's when Sarah, or whatever was inside her, began to speak. But it wasn't her voice. It was deep, masculine, filled with hatred and mockery. The words were in English, but they seemed to come from somewhere far darker than any human soul. You think your pathetic rituals can contain me, priest? I have walked this earth since before your God drew breath. I will tear the flesh from your bones and feed your entrails to the crows. The thing wearing Sarah's face turned its white eyes directly toward where I was hiding. My blood turned to ice. And you little spy in the shadows, it said, its lips curling into a grotesque smile. I can smell your fear from here. When I am free, you will be the first to die. Father McKenna's voice rose to a shout, drowning out the demonic threats. The other figures began chanting along with him, their voices creating an eerie chorus that echoed through the woods. Sarah's body began to convulse more violently, and suddenly something dark and shapeless, like black smoke with glowing red eyes, poured out of her mouth and nose. The shadow thing circled the clearing once, shrieking with rage, before disappearing into the forest canopy. Sarah's body dropped back onto the altar with a sickening thud, and the sudden silence was deafening. Father McKenna rushed to check her pulse while the others gathered around. After a long moment, he shook his head solemnly. The exorcism had been successful, but Sarah hadn't survived it. She's free now, I heard him whisper. But we cannot let anyone know what happened here. If word gets out about what we do, if the church hierarchy discovers our methods. 2 of the robed figures produced shovels from behind the trees, and they lifted Sarah's lifeless body, carrying it deeper into the woods. I knew I couldn't follow. If they discovered me, I might end up in an unmarked grave beside her. I ran through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face, until I reached the edge of town. I snuck back into my house and swore to myself that I would never speak of what I'd witnessed. But the nightmares started immediately. Every night, I dreamed of Sarah's white eyes and that horrible voice promising to find me. For months afterward, I couldn't bring myself to enter St. Mary's, even though my parents demanded I attend Sunday Mass. Father McKenna continued his work for 2 more years before he was quietly transferred to another parish. The disappearances stopped after he left, but by then, 3 more young women had vanished. Their families never learned the truth about what happened to their daughters. I'm 34 now, and I've never told anyone this story until today. I moved away from that town as soon as I graduated high school, but sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees, I can still hear that demonic voice echoing in my memory, promising vengeance that may yet come to pass. Some secrets are too dangerous to keep, but too terrible to share. This is mine. My name is Julian, and I've always been a skeptic when it comes to ghost stories and supernatural tales. You know, the kind of stories your grandmother tells you to keep you from wandering off at night, or the urban legends that spread through small towns like wildfire. But what I'm about to tell you shattered every rational belief I had. And even now, 3 years later, I still can't explain what happened during that summer in rural Pennsylvania. It all started when I decided to spend my college break at my grandfather's place. He lived in one of those forgotten towns tucked away in the Appalachian foothills, the kind of place where time seems to move differently. Colonial-era houses with peeling paint lined dirt roads, and an eerie silence hung over everything like a heavy blanket. Sometimes that silence was comforting, but other times it made your skin crawl. The moment I arrived, something felt off. The locals watched me with suspicious eyes, and even my grandfather, who was usually thrilled to see me, seemed more reserved than usual. He talked about normal things, the weather, his garden, the neighbors, but there was something he carefully avoided mentioning. Something I would later understand he was desperately trying to keep me away from, the old well. On my 3rd day there, while exploring the town's historic district, I stumbled upon the well for the first time. It sat in the corner of what used to be the town square, now overgrown with thorny vines and half hidden behind gnarled oak trees that seemed to lean inward, as if trying to conceal it from view. The structure was made of weathered fieldstone, with a rotting wooden cover that looked ready to collapse at any moment. There was something deeply unsettling about it, something that didn't belong in the same century as the rest of the town. When I got back to the house, I casually asked my grandfather about the well. He went dead silent for what felt like an eternity, then looked at me with eyes I'd never seen before and said, "Stay away from that place. Nothing good has ever come from it." I didn't want to push, but his reaction only made me more curious. Why would a simple well generate such fear? That night, as I lay in the guest room trying to sleep, I began to hear something strange. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like humming, but with an otherworldly quality I couldn't identify. I got up and peered through the curtains, but the town was dark and seemingly deserted. The sound was definitely there, though, floating on the night air. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself it was just the wind through the trees or maybe crickets. The next morning, I decided to walk around town to clear my head. The locals seemed even more withdrawn than usual, almost hostile. An elderly man in overalls stared at me intently, and when I nodded in greeting, he simply turned away and shuffled off. Later, an old woman selling fresh bread from her front porch approached me and whispered, "Did you hear the singing last night?" I was taken aback. I told her I wasn't sure what she meant, but she insisted, "Those voices aren't meant for outsiders. Stay away from the old well." Before I could respond, she hurried back inside, leaving me more confused than ever. That night the humming returned, but this time it was clearer. These weren't just random sounds, they were voices, harmonizing in some kind of ancient melody. Without really thinking about it, I put on my shoes and slipped out of the house. I followed the sound through the empty streets until I found myself standing before the well. A chill ran down my spine as I approached. The well seemed darker than the surrounding night, as if it was absorbing what little moonlight there was. The singing was definitely coming from deep within, and despite every rational thought in my head, I found it strangely hypnotic. I knelt down and tried to move the wooden cover, but it was far too heavy. That's when I noticed a strange smell like damp earth mixed with something else, something organic and rotten that I couldn't identify. I stayed there for several more minutes, listening to the ethereal voices, until something made me jerk back in terror. A sharp banging sound from inside the well, like something striking the stone walls. The sound was getting closer, as if something was climbing up from the depths. My blood turned to ice, and I ran back to the house as fast as my legs could carry me. But when I arrived, I found my grandfather waiting for me on the porch. His face was grim, almost angry. He looked at me and said, "I warned you to stay away. Now you're no longer a stranger to them." I didn't understand what he meant, but his tone made it clear that I had made a terrible mistake. The next day, things got even stranger. The townspeople weren't just avoiding me anymore. Some of them seemed to be following me. Whenever I went out, I could feel eyes watching me from shadowed doorways and curtained windows. I caught glimpses of faces that would quickly disappear when I looked directly at them. I tried to talk to my grandfather about it, but he just told me to stay inside the house until my visit was over. That night, I had the most vivid and terrifying nightmare of my life. The humming voices returned, but now they weren't just coming from the well, they seemed to be inside my head. In the dream, something invisible was dragging me from my bed, pulling me across the floor toward that cursed well. As I got closer, I could see human figures surrounding it, but their movements were wrong, too slow, too fluid, as if they were floating rather than walking. When I finally woke up at dawn, drenched in sweat, I knew I had to leave. I told my grandfather I needed to get back to the city, but he just looked at me with those same tired eyes and said, "It doesn't matter where you go now. You're marked." I left anyway, trying to dismiss his words, but they echoed in my mind for the entire drive home. Over the following weeks, back in my apartment in Philadelphia, I started noticing things that shouldn't have been possible. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear the same haunting melody drifting through my walls. The nightmares continued. Always the same dream of being dragged toward that well, something calling to me from the darkness below. I never found out what that well really was or what those voices meant, but I'm certain that something ancient and malevolent lives in that place. Or perhaps something terrible happened there long ago, leaving behind a spiritual wound that refuses to heal. Whatever the truth is, I know that some places in this world are meant to remain undisturbed, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. The humming still comes to me sometimes, even now, carried on the wind through my bedroom window. And I know, deep in my bones, that someday I'll have to return to that forgotten town and face whatever is waiting for me at the bottom of that well. I grew up in a small town in rural Oregon where everyone knew everyone else. There wasn't much to talk about. Lives were simple and routine. except when the name of Mrs. Evelyn Marsh came up in conversation. She was an elderly woman who lived alone in an old farmhouse at the edge of town, isolated from everything and everyone. She'd never had a family, no children or husband that anyone could remember. And the few times she was seen outside her property were when she came to the farmer's market, covered in a long shawl, barely exchanging words with anyone. There were rumors that Mrs. Marsh had certain gifts, though nobody spoke openly about magic or witchcraft. People said she had a way of helping those who sought her out, usually for matters of health or the heart. The conversations were always hushed, always vague. But there was an understanding among the older residents that she could do things doctors couldn't. I was always skeptical. For me, those were just idle gossip from people who didn't have anything more interesting to think about. My younger sister Sarah used to joke with me about it. If she really was some kind of healer, she would have solved everyone's problems by now, wouldn't she? She'd say. But when things started going wrong in our family, it wasn't so easy to make jokes anymore. Sarah began getting sick out of nowhere. At first, it was simple things: fatigue, loss of appetite, trouble sleeping. But then she started getting worse. My mother took her to see Dr. Henderson several times, but nobody could find anything wrong. The tests came back normal, the blood work was fine, and yet Sarah kept declining. She was only 19, had always been healthy and active, but suddenly she was like a shadow of herself. My mother, desperate for answers, kept insisting we should go see Mrs. Marsh, but I was completely against it. I didn't believe in that nonsense, didn't want to get involved with superstitions and folk remedies. Sarah wasn't convinced either, but the situation was wearing her down. She was scared, and nothing the doctors tried seemed to help. One Thursday, without telling me, Sarah decided to go on her own. She came back that evening and told me that Mrs. Marsh had received her kindly. The old woman had given her some herbs to brew into tea and told her to drink it every night for 2 weeks. Even though I didn't like the idea, I decided not to argue. Most likely nothing will happen, I thought. And at first, everything continued the same, but after about a week, Sarah started to improve. Gradually, she regained her appetite and energy and seemed more like her old self again. However, what disturbed me wasn't her recovery, it was her behavior. Sarah no longer wanted to talk about what had happened. When I asked her about her visit to Mrs. Marsh, she'd change the subject or just ignore me completely. It was like she was keeping some secret, something she couldn't or wouldn't share. My mother was thrilled, of course. She said Mrs. Marsh had performed a miracle and that we should be grateful to her. But I didn't share that view. Something didn't add up. I felt like there was more behind all of this, so I decided to go speak with the old woman myself. One gray October afternoon, I worked up the courage and drove out to her place. The old wooden gate creaked as I pushed it open, and Mrs. Marsh answered the door as if she'd been expecting me. She invited me in without saying much and offered me a cup of the same tea she'd given Sarah. I refused, of course. I just wanted answers. "What did you do to Sarah?" I asked her bluntly, without beating around the bush. Mrs. Marsh looked at me calmly, unperturbed by my directness. Her face, weathered by years of living alone, showed a strange serenity. "I didn't do anything she didn't ask for," she replied in a soft tone. "I only helped her find what she had lost." "What does that mean?" I pressed, frustrated by her evasive answer. "Your sister was unbalanced, disconnected from her true self. she explained. I simply helped her reconnect with her inner strength. Nothing she said sounded supernatural. She didn't talk about curses or spells, but the way she said it made me deeply uncomfortable. There was something in the tone of her voice, something almost hypnotic, that made me doubt everything I thought I knew. I couldn't get any more information from her, so I left, not really knowing what to think. In the following days, I started noticing strange things not just about Sarah, but about other people in town. Those who had visited Mrs. Marsh seemed different, somehow more reserved, more secretive. They acted normally on the surface, but there was a kind of guardedness in their eyes, a shadow in their behavior that I couldn't explain. I began to feel like the whole town shared a secret that I wasn't part of. One afternoon, while walking through the town square, I ran into Tom Bradley, a neighbor who had suffered from chronic back pain for years. He told me that after a visit to Mrs. Marsh, his pain had completely disappeared. When I asked if he'd noticed anything strange about the experience, he just gave me an odd smile and said, "She helps, but everything has a price." That phrase stuck with me. What price? Nobody talked about it directly, but something told me that although Sarah had gotten better, the cost of Mrs. Marsh's help wasn't something you could measure in dollars and cents. I couldn't stop thinking about what she had said. I only helped her find what she had lost. The atmosphere in town began to change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I could feel it. It wasn't anything physical, it was more of a sensation, like something heavy was hanging in the air. People who had once been open and cheerful now seemed more cautious, as if something was holding them back. Was it just my paranoia, or was something genuinely strange happening? What really bothered me was that Sarah, despite being physically healthy again, seemed to have lost something else, some spark, some essential part of who she used to be. She was functional, went through the motions of normal life, but it was like she was sleepwalking through her days. When I tried to talk to her about it, she'd just stare at me with those distant eyes and say she was fine. As time passed, I decided to distance myself from the whole situation. I stopped asking Sarah about her experience, and though she remained physically well, there was a gap between us that I couldn't bridge. It was as if her encounter with Mrs. Marsh had left an invisible mark on her, something that couldn't be erased or healed. More people in town started visiting the old woman. They'd come back changed in ways that were hard to define, quieter, more compliant, like part of their personality had been smoothed away. They were grateful, yes, but it was a hollow kind of gratitude, like they were reading from a script they didn't remember learning. I started to understand what Tom had meant about everything having a price. Mrs. Marsh didn't ask for money. She asked for something much more valuable. She took away pain, sickness, and suffering, but she also seemed to take away something essential, some piece of what made each person unique. They came to her broken and left whole, but it was a different kind of wholeness than what they'd had before. In the end, I never knew what to think. Was Mrs. Marsh a witch, a healer, or just an old woman with abilities we didn't understand? Maybe she was all of those things, or maybe none of them. What I do know is that, although everything seemed to return to normal on the surface, underneath, there was always that feeling of unease. The kind of unease you get when you know something isn't quite right, but you can't do anything to fix it. Perhaps Mrs. Marsh is still there, in her farmhouse at the edge of town, waiting for the next desperate soul to knock on her door seeking help. And maybe, like so many others, they'll leave grateful and changed. But I wonder if they'll ever realize what they've traded away, or if they'll even remember who they used to be before they asked for her help. Some cures, I've learned, can be worse than the disease. I want to share a story that my grandfather told me when he was close to his deathbed. The truth is, I never saw him as a superstitious person, or one of those who believe in ghosts or things like that. But what he told me was so shocking that it has stayed with me ever since. I don't usually share it with just anyone, but I feel this is the right place to get it off my chest. My grandfather lived in a mining town back in the 1960s. That place had been prosperous, with hundreds of families depending on the mine. But over time, life there changed dramatically. The mine had a tremendous accident in which more than 20 workers died, trapped under tons of rock. Rescue attempts failed, and most families decided to leave shortly after. The place gradually became empty until it turned into a ghost town. Dilapidated houses, deserted streets, and the mine completely closed. By that time, my grandfather was practically the last one to stay. It wasn't that he liked the isolation. He simply had nowhere to go back then. It wasn't easy to find work elsewhere, and selling property in such a desolate place was impossible. So he stayed. He had his small cabin on the edge of town and lived off what little he could hunt and grow. What he never lacked was silence. A silence that, according to him, began to become disturbing. At first, my grandfather said it was a peaceful, quiet place. But things changed after a few months. He told me that at night, he began to hear noises. They were banging sounds, as if someone were hammering the earth from inside the mine. He thought they might be small cave-ins or the echo of wind seeping through the abandoned tunnels. But the sound was too constant, too loud to be just that. It didn't take long to become disturbing. One night, when he was about to go to sleep, those banging sounds echoed with a force that made him get out of bed. It was as if someone was desperately trying to get out of there. He told me with a trembling voice when he told me the story. He lit his oil lamp, and despite the fear he felt, decided to approach the mine. He confessed to me that it was the worst decision of his life. The night was calm, with a full moon illuminating the landscape. Only the creaking of wood under his boots and those banging sounds could be heard, becoming clearer as he approached. There were no signs of life throughout the town. Upon reaching the sealed entrance of the mine, the banging stopped. Suddenly, everything was left in a deafening silence, and in the air there was a strange smell, like wet earth mixed with sulfur. My grandfather wasn't a man of easy fears, but at that moment, something inside him screamed that he wasn't alone. He was standing in front of the closed mine, and he swore he saw a flash of light, a kind of faint glow coming from between the cracks in the wood that sealed the entrance. It wasn't a reflection or a fire, but something more, strange. Then, from among the shadows, he saw the silhouettes. He told me that at first he thought he was being suggestive because of everything that had happened. He believed that maybe there were shadows formed by trees or rocks. But no, he couldn't fool his intelligence, and deep down he knew that. They were the figures of men, the miners who had died in the accident. Their bodies were covered with dust and soot. They had an empty look, but what terrified him most was that they didn't seem to be looking for help. They didn't want to be freed. Somehow he knew it. What they really wanted was something else: company. My grandfather felt his heart racing in his chest. He tried to move to back away, but his legs wouldn't respond. I was trapped, as if fear had nailed me to the ground, he told me. He was about to panic when suddenly a gust of cold air hit him and pulled him out of the trance. He ran back to his cabin without looking back, with the feeling that those silhouettes were following him from a distance, although he never saw anything when he turned around. That night he couldn't sleep, and for several days he felt sick, as if something had absorbed all his energy. He decided he couldn't stay in that place any longer. The next day, he packed what little he had and left the town forever. The strangest thing was what happened afterward. On his journey to another nearby town, where he planned to sell some of his belongings to start over, he stopped at a roadside store. There, while talking with one of the old merchants, he heard a story that left him disturbed. They told him that the accident in the mine had been worse than was publicly known. Apparently, many of the bodies were never recovered, and the mine was hastily sealed. It was rumored that some miners remained alive for days, trapped inside, and that their souls never rested in peace. They believe they are tied to that place. My grandfather lived the rest of his life far from that cursed mine, but he never forgot what he had seen. He always wondered what would have happened if he hadn't run that night. Maybe something could have taken him inside that mine, and he would have become another trapped soul, destined to wander in the underground darkness. No one knows. Before dying, my grandfather confessed to me that for a long time he had nightmares in which those miners came looking for him, calling him from the darkness, from beneath the earth. They never left me completely alone, he told me. They knew I saw them, and they wanted me to join them. That's the reason I never went near that place again. It still exists, and some people say it's possible to visit the ruins of the town, although no one usually stays very long. The air there is too heavy, and often, if you get close to the mine, you can still hear the banging. To this day, I haven't wanted to reveal the name of that town. It's not out of fear of being judged or laughed at, but because I don't want people, out of simple curiosity, to go and disturb the place. Whoever is there, the spirits of the miners or whatever remains of them, deserves to rest in peace, or at least to remain where they are. But the story doesn't end with my grandfather's death. About 5 years ago, I received a letter that changed everything I thought I knew about that place. It came from a woman named Sarah Mitchell, who claimed to be researching historical mining accidents in Colorado for a documentary project. In her letter, she mentioned that she had come across my grandfather's name in some old records from the 1970s. Apparently, he had filed a report with the county sheriff about unusual disturbances near the abandoned Blackrock mine. The sheriff had dismissed it as the ramblings of an isolated old man. But Sarah had found the report intriguing enough to investigate further. What she discovered in the archives made my blood run cold. The Blackrock mine hadn't just had one accident. There had been 3 separate incidents over the course of 10 years. The first was in 1958, when 12 men were trapped in a tunnel collapse. The second was in 1964, when a gas explosion killed 8 more workers. The final and worst accident happened in 1967, the one my grandfather had known about, which claimed 23 lives. But here's what chilled me to the bone. According to Sarah's research, the mine company had covered up the true extent of the accidents. They had been using unsafe mining practices to maximize profit. And when the accidents happened, they simply sealed the tunnels rather than properly recovering all the bodies. Over the years, a total of 43 miners had died in those tunnels, and most of their bodies were never brought to the surface. Sarah's letter included copies of newspaper clippings she had found, detailing reports of strange occurrences at the mine site throughout the 1970s and 80s. People reported hearing banging sounds, seeing strange lights, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread near the sealed entrances. Several amateur explorers had attempted to enter the mine over the years, but all had fled within minutes, describing an atmosphere of malevolent presence. Most disturbing of all, Sarah mentioned that she had attempted to visit the site herself the previous summer. She had driven to the location with a small film crew, planning to document the abandoned town for her project. But when they arrived at the mine entrance, their equipment began malfunctioning, cameras shutting down, audio equipment producing strange static, and their vehicle's engine dying repeatedly. As they attempted to set up their gear, they all heard it. The rhythmic banging sounds coming from deep within the sealed mine, just as my grandfather had described. But Sarah wrote that it wasn't random banging. It had a pattern, almost like a code. 3 short bangs, 3 long ones, 3 short again. SOS, the universal distress signal. They left immediately, but as they drove away, Sarah looked back and swore she saw figures standing at the mine entrance, silhouetted against the setting sun. Dark shapes that seemed to be watching their departure with what she could only describe as disappointment. In her letter, Sarah asked if I would be willing to share my grandfather's story for her documentary. She promised to keep the location anonymous and focus on the historical aspects of mining safety rather than the supernatural elements. But I declined. Some stories, I told her, are meant to stay buried, just like the men who are still trapped in those dark tunnels, forever calling for help that will never come. I never heard from Sarah again, and I sometimes wonder if her research led her back to that cursed place. Part of me hopes she heeded my warning and left those sleeping ghosts alone. But another part of me fears that the miners finally got the company they had been seeking for so many decades. Good evening. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. I'm just a regular guy, a family man, hardworking. And though I've lived in this same small town in rural Montana my entire life, I never paid much attention to the old stories the elderly folks would tell. But I'm going to be honest with you. After what happened to me that night back in November, I'm not so sure everything is just tall tales anymore. It was a Tuesday night, nothing special about it, and I was alone in the house. My wife had taken the kids to visit her sister in Billings for the week, and I stayed behind because I had an early shift at the lumber mill the next morning. Nothing out of the ordinary. I went to bed early like always and was sleeping like a rock until suddenly, around 3 a.m, I was jolted awake by this strange sound. At first, I thought it might be one of those big 18-wheelers rolling through town on Highway 206. But after listening for a few seconds, I realized it wasn't that at all. The sound was more ancient, if that makes any sense. It sounded like the creaking of old wooden wheels and the steady clip-clop of horse hooves on pavement. And yes, I know how crazy that sounds because nobody in Whitefish uses horse-drawn wagons anymore, especially not at 3 a.m. I stayed in bed, trying to listen more carefully. The sound kept getting closer and closer, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. I'd heard the old stories my whole life, and though I never believed them, in that moment I remembered what the old-timers used to say about the death cart. According to them, when you hear it rolling down your street, it's because it's coming for someone. Of course, my rational side tried to take control. It's just nonsense, I told myself, but the sound kept getting nearer and nearer. The worst part was when it stopped right in front of my house. I swear my blood ran cold in that moment. The street was completely empty, but I could feel this presence, like something heavy was sitting right outside my front door. I got up slowly from bed, trying not to make any noise, and walked toward the living room window. That's when I remembered what the old folks always said. Never look at the death cart, because if you do, you're sealing your own fate or that of someone close to you. So even though the window was just a few steps away, I froze. I couldn't bring myself to peek outside, even though curiosity was eating me alive. I knew something was out there, something I shouldn't see. The tension in the house was unbearable. It felt like the air itself had become thick and heavy, almost like I couldn't breathe properly. Then I heard it. I don't know how to explain it, but it was like someone was whispering my name from the street, and my heart started pounding faster and faster. It's just your imagination, I kept telling myself, but that whisper wouldn't stop. There was no wind, no other sounds of any kind, just that voice that somehow knew it was calling for me. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it couldn't be real, that there had to be some logical explanation. But just when I was about to open the curtain and look outside, I heard another sound. It was like something heavy and solid had dropped to the ground outside, a dull thud. I didn't dare move. Fear had me completely paralyzed, and the cart was still there, or at least it seemed to be. I don't know how long I stood there, too scared to look. I just remember that suddenly, the sound of the wooden wheels started up again, slowly moving away until the street fell into complete silence once more. I don't know if you've ever been so frightened that you feel like your heart might explode, but that's exactly what I felt in that moment. I stayed awake until dawn broke. I couldn't close my eyes, not after that. When the sun finally came up, I felt such relief that I almost laughed at how stupid I'd been acting. I told myself it had just been my mind playing tricks on me, that maybe I'd heard some animal or something like that making noise outside. But here's the strangest part of all that morning. While I was drinking my coffee and trying to shake off the whole experience, I found out that my neighbor, old Frank Peterson, had died during the night. He was an elderly man who'd been sick with cancer for months, so it wasn't entirely unexpected. But what really disturbed me was the fact that the death cart had stopped right in front of my house, which is directly next to his. I never told anyone what happened that night because I was embarrassed to admit that I'd been scared by what I thought was just an old legend. But the truth is, I haven't been able to shake that feeling ever since. Every time night falls, I think about what I heard, about that whisper calling my name and that heavy thud, like something had come to take someone away. Look, maybe it was all just a coincidence. Maybe the death cart had nothing to do with Frank's passing. But since that night, I can't stop thinking that death really does walk these streets, searching for whoever's time has come. Sometimes, on very quiet nights when everything is still and silent, I lie awake in bed, hoping I never hear those wooden wheels again. or those horse hooves echoing on the old brick streets of our little town. I haven't seen or heard anything like that since that November night, but the feeling that something was there, so close to me, has never left. And I'll tell you something, now whenever someone mentions they've heard those sounds in the early morning hours, I choose not to doubt them. I don't want to know if the next time the death cart passes through town, it'll be coming for me. Now that I've told you my story, I wonder if I'm the only one who's experienced something like this. I know these things sound like pure superstition, and believe me, I used to think so too, until this happened to me. I don't know if it was my mind playing cruel tricks on me, or if there really is something beyond what we can see or understand. I've wondered if maybe some of you have heard that same sound in the night, the creaking of wooden wheels and the clip-clop of horse hooves on pavement. Have you ever felt that strange presence, like death itself was lurking nearby? These experiences, no matter how hard we try to ignore them, stay with us somehow. They become part of who we are, whether we want them to or not. I don't know if it would comfort me to know I'm not alone in this, or if that would just make the whole thing even more unsettling. After all, some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some sounds are better left unheard. Thank you for listening. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.